My name is Minho Kang, and for the first 22 years of my life, my nose was completely useless. I was the kind of guy who could stand next to a burning pan and ask why the kitchen looked foggy. Then one Tuesday morning, I woke up because I could smell black pepper from 3 apartments away. Not food, not breakfast, specifically black pepper. Freshly cracked, slightly oily, cheap supermarket brand, sitting on scrambled eggs that had been overcooked by approximately 40 seconds. I knew all of that before I even opened my eyes. Naturally, I assumed I was dying. I sat up, sniffed once, and immediately regretted being born. My blanket smelled like detergent, dust, one old French fry crumb, and the ghost of every bad decision I had made while eating in bed. My pillow smelled like shampoo, skin oil, and the tiny amount of instant coffee I had spilled on it 2 weeks earlier and claimed I cleaned. The room had layers now, hundreds of them. It was like somebody had taken the world, turned the scent settings from potato quality to ultra graphics, then stapled the control panel directly into my skull. The weirdest part came the next morning. Everything was just a little clearer. Not dramatically, maybe 1%. I could tell the pepper from apartment 503 was Indonesian instead of Vietnamese. On the 3rd morning, I could smell that my roommate Jisoo had stolen one of my strawberry yogurts and replaced it with the same brand from a different convenience store because the refrigerator plastic had a slightly different factory smell. He denied it until I told him the stolen cup had been eaten with the metal spoon he used for curry the night before. That was when he stared at me like I had peeled open his browser history with my nostrils. To be fair, if my nose had started detecting incognito tabs, I would have launched myself off the balcony before breakfast. I started testing it because I was broke, bored, and apparently too stupid to fear supernatural medical conditions. Every morning, I wrote down what I could smell. Day 6, I identified every ingredient in Jisoo's stew from the hallway. Day 9, I knew which elevator had carried fried chicken in the last hour. Day 12, I could tell that a woman on the subway had sprayed perfume over cigarette smoke, that the man beside her worked near engine oil, and that somebody at the far end of the car had a banana in their bag that was exactly 1 day away from becoming disgusting. Day 15 was when I realized the improvement never reset. My sense of smell wasn't becoming 1% better than normal. It was becoming 1% better than yesterday. That tiny difference was compounding. I opened a calculator and stared at the numbers. After a year, if this continued, my nose would be almost 38 times more sensitive than it had been at the start. After 2 years, more than 1,000 times. After 5 years, the number was so stupid I checked the calculator twice, then once more because denial is free. My nose was on track to become approximately 77 million times sharper. I looked at Jisoo. He looked at me. Then he slowly lowered the kimchi container he had just opened. That bastard had the expression of a man realizing his roommate was evolving into a police dog with rent obligations. At first, I used my ability for the only noble purpose a broke man could think of: free food. There was a small restaurant near campus that offered a free meal if anyone could guess the secret ingredients in its spicy broth. Nobody had won because the owner used 23 ingredients, including 3 kinds of fermented paste, dried anchovy stock, pear juice, roasted onion skin, and something he called family magic. I walked in, bought 1 bowl with my last 12,000 won, and smelled it. I named 22 ingredients before the spoon touched my mouth. The owner went pale. The 23rd scent was weird. Floral, earthy, slightly medicinal. I leaned over the bowl like a possessed sommelier and said it was 1 dried chrysanthemum petal that had been toasted in sesame oil. The man dropped his ladle. I ate free for a month. By week 4, the ability had stopped feeling like a freak accident and started feeling like a cheat code. I could walk through the produce section of a supermarket and know which peaches were sweet without touching them. I could smell spoiled chicken through sealed packaging. I could tell whether an avocado was ready from halfway down the aisle. Once, I warned an employee that milk in the back fridge had gone bad even though the expiration date was 3 days away. He checked. A cooling line had failed behind the wall. That should have been the moment I used my gift responsibly. Instead, I spent the next afternoon ranking convenience store sausages by what I called their emotional honesty. The cheap cheese sausage smelled like hot plastic, salt, and broken promises. The premium one smelled like pork, smoke, and a man in accounting trying his best. The fish sausage smelled like Poseidon had sneezed into a gym sock. I posted the ranking online, and for reasons I still do not understand, it got 600,000 views. Suddenly people wanted me to smell things. Restaurants invited me. Cafes sent beans. A perfume shop offered me money to identify counterfeit bottles. One bakery owner handed me a tray of 12 identical croissants and told me one had been made with cheaper butter. I found it in 2 seconds. Then I found 3 more. He fired his supplier before I finished chewing. My small channel became a big channel. The comments called me Nose Appa, Scent Goblin, Sir Sniffs a Lot, and one name so disgusting that I reported it while laughing for 5 minutes. The internet had discovered a man with a supernatural nose and immediately decided the highest use of civilization was asking whether I could smell a fart before it technically happened. At that point, my career plan had the structural integrity of a gas station condom. Yet somehow every terrible decision kept producing revenue. For the record, at day 42, the answer became yes. That knowledge changed me, not spiritually. I just stopped trusting elevators. The first real money came from truffles. A luxury restaurant owner named Chairman Bake contacted me after seeing a video where I identified 12 kinds of mushroom while blindfolded. He was short, rich, loud, and dressed like he had personally mugged a velvet curtain. He told me imported truffles cost a fortune, and local hunters struggled to find wild ones. He wanted to know whether my nose could do what trained dogs did. I told him I had no idea. He offered me 5 million won for 1 day. I told him I was available forever. 2 days later, I stood in a mountain forest wearing borrowed hiking boots while Chairman Bake, 3 chefs, 2 truffle hunters, and 1 insultingly muscular pig watched me sniff dirt. The pig's name was Napoleon. Napoleon hated me immediately. The normal method involved waiting for the pig to detect truffles underground. My method involved closing my eyes and inhaling once. At first, I smelled wet bark, moss, old leaves, insect shells, animal droppings, cold stone, and 6 different kinds of fungus. Then beneath all of that, about 30 meters uphill, there was a dark, nutty, musky scent hiding under the soil. I pointed. They dug. Truffle. I pointed again. Another truffle. Then another. Within an hour, I had found more than Napoleon usually found in 3 days. The pig stared at me with the dead eyes of a union worker watching a robot take his job. When I found a cluster directly beneath the tree he had peed on, he screamed so loudly that even Chairman Bake stepped back. I swear that pig looked ready to beat my ass in the parking lot and key my car, which was extra threatening because I didn't own a car. By sunset, we had baskets worth tens of millions of won. That was when I stopped thinking of my ability as a party trick. Smell was information, and information could be converted into money with almost disrespectful efficiency. I started taking unusual jobs. A hotel paid me to locate a mystery odor in a luxury suite. I sniffed twice and found a dead mouse inside a ventilation duct 3 floors away. A cafe chain hired me to inspect coffee beans, and I discovered one supplier was mixing lower-grade beans into expensive shipments. A seafood warehouse used me to detect spoiled stock before it contaminated anything else. A cosmetics company paid me to identify why one batch of face cream smelled different, and I traced it to a cleaning chemical used on one valve at the factory. Every morning, my nose became 1% better. That sounds small until it happens for months. By day 100, walking through a crowded street was like reading invisible biographies. I knew who had eaten garlic, who had changed motor oil, which delivery truck carried oranges, which apartment had a gas stove with a tiny leak. I could smell rain before the clouds reached us because I detected wet soil carried on air from kilometers away. The problem was that I could also smell everything horrible. Trash collection days became spiritual warfare. Public bathrooms became forbidden zones. Fish markets felt like somebody had waterboarded my soul with fermented regret. Once I entered a subway car and instantly knew a man near the door had stepped in dog poop 7 hours earlier, cleaned his shoe twice, and still had a microscopic amount trapped beneath the left heel. There are things no human being should know. My nose had become the cursed library of Alexandria, except every book was written in armpit, so I adapted. I bought industrial masks, charcoal filters, nose clips, and enough mint oil to make my apartment smell like a toothpaste factory had exploded. I trained myself to focus on individual scent layers. At first it felt impossible. Then one evening, while Jisoo cooked noodles, I realized I could isolate smells deliberately. Instead of smelling the whole room, I could choose garlic, then onion, then metal from the pot, then hot dust from the heating coil. Each scent became a line I could follow. That was how I discovered the leak. I was walking through an underground shopping mall when I caught a faint mineral smell mixed with old concrete. Not mold, not sewage, water. I followed it past a shoe store, down a hallway, and stopped beside a decorative wall. The building manager thought I was joking when I I said there was a pressurized water leak behind the tiles. Then a plumber opened the wall and found a cracked pipe spraying into a hidden cavity. The concrete inside was already saturated. Another week and the ceiling below might have collapsed. The mall paid me 10 million won. A plumbing company called me the next day. Then another. For 3 months, I became the most overqualified leak detector in Seoul. I walked through hotels, offices, apartment towers, and factories, sniffing walls like a lunatic raccoon. I found tiny gas leaks, coolant leaks, electrical insulation overheating behind panels, sewer vents installed wrong, mold behind luxury wallpaper, and once, one bottle of fish sauce that had fallen inside a restaurant wall during renovations 6 years earlier. The restaurant owner cried when we found it, not because of the smell, because he had spent nearly 40 million won replacing ventilation equipment trying to solve the problem. I held up the ancient fish sauce bottle and realized my nose had just defeated 6 engineers and a building consultant. That should have made me humble. Instead, I went home, put the bottle's photo on a mug, and gave it to Jisoo for his birthday. He called me a dickhead, and used the mug anyway. Then, around day 170, something changed. I smelled a coin through a drawer. Not the drawer. Not the dust. Not the fingerprints on the coin. The metal itself. I had noticed metallic scents before, of course, especially iron and copper, but people usually say metal has no smell, and what we call a metallic odor comes from reactions with skin oils. My nose no longer cared about what people usually said. I could detect tiny chemical signatures, surface oxidation, contamination, microscopic particles, and whatever other nonsense my increasingly supernatural brain had decided counted as smell. I pulled out 3 coins and tested myself. Copper-rich alloy smelled warm and sharp. Nickel had a colder bite. Zinc had a dry, dusty note. I spent the next week visiting hardware stores and junk shops like a pervert for metallurgy. Steel, aluminum, brass, tin, lead, silver. Each had a pattern. Gold was the strangest. Pure gold barely reacted with anything, but jewelry carried traces from polishing compounds, skin, alloy metals, microscopic abrasion, and the environments where it had been stored. At first, I could only identify gold I already knew was there. Then my brain started separating those surrounding clues, until the gold itself seemed to produce a silent blank spot in the scent landscape. A smooth absence where other metals behaved noisily. It was like smelling a hole. That sentence made no sense. Neither did my life. I bought a tiny 1-gram gold bar from a dealer and spent 2 hours sniffing it. If anyone had entered my apartment, they would have seen a grown man holding a miniature ingot under his nose like cocaine for dragons. There was no dignified explanation for that. I looked like I was about to rail a line of retirement savings off the kitchen counter. But the practice worked. Within a month, I could identify gold jewelry inside closed boxes. Then inside drawers, then behind walls. The first time that ability made serious money, I wasn't even trying. An elderly landlord hired me because tenants complained about a musty smell in a renovated building. I found the mold problem in minutes. On my way out, I paused near a staircase. There was gold nearby. Faint, old, dusty, mixed with dry wood and plaster. I followed the scent to a wall cavity beneath the stairs. The landlord said nothing was there. I asked permission to open it. Behind a panel, we found a rusted metal box wrapped in newspaper from 1987. Inside were 23 old gold rings, 6 bracelets, foreign coins, and a note from the landlord's father explaining that he had hidden emergency savings during a financial scare and apparently forgotten to tell anyone. The landlord sat on the floor and laughed until he cried. I sat beside him and stared at the gold. Until that moment, I had been using smell to find problems. Now I had found value, and my brain, which was sadly controlled by a 22-year-old with unstable income and no sense of restraint, immediately asked the most dangerous question possible. I had basically become a geological OnlyFans account where the Earth sent me mineral nudes and corporations paid obscene subscription fees to ask where the gold was. What else was hiding underground? The answer apparently was a lot. I began with parks. Not because I expected pirate treasure under a public bench, but because parks were full of harmless test objects. Coins fell out of pockets. Rings slipped off fingers. Keys disappeared into grass. If I could learn to track small amounts of metal through soil, I could measure exactly how ridiculous my nose had become without accidentally wandering onto somebody's private property and getting arrested for sniffing their foundation. On my first Saturday, I went to a riverside park with Jisoo and a borrowed metal detector. He carried the detector. I carried nothing because I wanted a fair comparison. He found a bottle cap in 9 minutes. I found 11 coins, 2 earrings, a bent spoon, a toy car, one fishing hook, and a silver bracelet before he finished swearing at the bottle cap. The trick was not smelling metal directly from 10 meters away. Not yet. I smelled disturbed soil, rust traces, oils, mineral changes, and the tiny differences in moisture around buried objects. Metal affected the dirt. Dirt affected water. Water affected microbes. Microbes affected gases. My nose followed that entire chain backward like an accountant reconstructing a crime scene from one missing receipt. By lunch, Jisoo had stopped using the detector. He just followed me around holding plastic bags. Then I stopped beside a tree and smelled something old. Copper, leather, rot, soil, a little silver. We dug down about 30 centimeters and found a wallet that looked like it had survived 3 presidential administrations and a war with lawn equipment. The cash was ruined, but inside was an old military identification card and a small medal. We turned it over to the park office. A week later, a retired man contacted us. He had lost the wallet during a picnic 18 years earlier. He offered us money. I refused. Jisoo did not refuse the homemade dumplings his wife sent. We ate 42 of them in one evening. That was the point where my treasure hunting career officially began. Not with gold, but with fermented cabbage, nostalgia, and enough dumplings to make my digestive system file for divorce. I bought my own metal detector anyway, mostly for appearances. If I wandered around a field sniffing the ground, people called security. If I did the same thing while holding a metal detector, people nodded like I was enjoying a normal hobby. The machine became camouflage for my face. It also became unnecessary within 3 weeks. My nose was improving too fast. I could smell silver coins through packed soil, copper pipes beneath concrete, old nails inside timber. I learned that different kinds of dirt had personalities. Clay held moisture and trapped scents. Sand leaked information quickly. Loam was noisy because it was full of organic matter. Recently disturbed soil had a completely different profile from untouched ground. Gravel was basically gossiping all day. Then I met Professor Han. He was a geology professor who saw one of my videos and decided I was either a fraud or the most interesting medical accident in Korea. He invited me to his university lab and placed 20 sealed sample boxes on a table. Each contained a rock or mineral. The whole situation was so spectacularly stupid that if an ancestor had appeared and asked what I did for a living, I would have pretended to be unemployed. I was not allowed to touch them. He wanted me to identify which boxes contained iron-rich minerals, sulfides, copper ore, and quartz. I got 19 out of 20. The 20th box was empty. I stared at him. He smiled. I told him the empty box had previously contained a sulfur-bearing mineral and had been cleaned with ethanol. His smile disappeared. That was the exact moment a respected geology professor began looking at me the way anime scientists look at an alien egg right before the laboratory explodes. For the next month, Professor Han taught me geology in exchange for testing my ability. I learned about ore bodies, host rock, hydrothermal alteration, sulfide minerals, rare earth elements, groundwater, faults, and all the incredibly expensive methods companies use to figure out what was beneath the surface. Companies drilled cores, flew magnetic surveys, measured gravity, tested conductivity, analyzed soil samples, mapped geology, spent months collecting data. I inhaled. That felt unfair. Professor Han took me to a training field where students studied exposed rock layers. Before anyone told me what was there, I started describing the slope by smell. Iron oxidation to the east. Sulfur compounds near the creek. Wet clay underneath the loose gravel. A quartz-rich band uphill. Something copper-like deeper inside one ridge. The professor stared at the map in his hand, then at me, then back at the map. He asked how far down I could smell. I said I had no idea. So naturally, we tested it in the stupidest way possible. The department had access to an old quarry with known mineral samples placed in buried training boxes. The deepest target was 5 meters underground. I found all of them. Then I smelled something outside the training area. It was not one of the boxes. About 40 meters from us, beneath a patch of weeds, there was a sharp metallic note wrapped in wet stone and orange soil. We dug a shallow trench with permission from the site manager and found a narrow band of iron-rich rock nobody cared about commercially. Professor Han was delighted. I was offended. I had just discovered an ore occurrence by breathing, and it was worth approximately nothing. Apparently geology had loot boxes too, and most of them contained common-grade garbage. I kept training. That was when I learned the biggest lesson of my new career. Detecting something underground was only half the problem. Knowing whether it was valuable was harder. Gold did not usually sit underground as shiny cartoon bars waiting for me. It could be microscopic particles scattered through rock. Copper could be present at useless concentrations. Rare minerals could exist in amounts too small to mine. A deposit could be rich but impossible to access. I needed context, so I built a scent library. Professor Han gave me labeled samples. Mining suppliers sold me ore specimens. I visited museums. I bought cheap rock collections online. I smelled granite, basalt, limestone, shale, coal, pyrite, chalcopyrite, malachite, galena, magnetite, bauxite, gypsum, fluorite, graphite, and dozens more. My apartment became a geological convenience store. Jisoo opened one cabinet looking for noodles and found 6 kilograms of rocks. He asked why I had rocks where food should be. I told him the rocks were investments. He looked at me for a full 5 seconds and said that was exactly what people say before joining the most brain-dead cult on Earth. He had a point. My scent library changed everything. Once I knew a mineral's pattern, I could recognize tiny traces in mixed material, or became a chord instead of a single note. Sulfide smelled one way, oxidation products another. Groundwater moving through mineralized rock carried hints of what it had touched. Dust drifting downhill carried microscopic signatures. Even plants changed depending on the soil beneath them. My nose was no longer just detecting objects. It was reading systems. Professor Han arranged my first legitimate exploration job through a small company called Daesung Minerals. They owned rights to an abandoned tungsten prospect in the mountains. Historical records suggested there might be useful mineralization deeper underground, but drilling was expensive. They wanted me to walk the property and tell them whether anything smelled interesting. The CEO, Mr. No, was not impressed when he met me. He was 60, sunburned, and had the exhausted face of a man who had spent 30 years giving money to mountains and receiving rocks in return. He asked if I was the internet sniffing guy. I said yes. He looked at Professor Han like the professor had brought a circus performer to a funeral. Then I stepped out of the truck. The mountain hit me all at once. Pine resin, wet leaves, granite, clay, diesel from old equipment, rusted steel, stream water, animal trails, decomposing wood. Mineral dust carried through tiny fractures in the ground. I closed my eyes. There, a thin metallic bitterness beneath the ordinary stone. Then another. I walked uphill. Every few steps the pattern changed. I could almost feel the shape of the underground rock through my nose. Something mineralized was running diagonally beneath us. I marked the route with flags. Mr. No followed silently. After 2 hours I had drawn a crooked line across the mountain and pointed to 3 places where the scent became strongest. He told his crew to compare my line with the old mine records. It matched a vein system that historical workers had followed underground 70 years earlier. That alone was impressive. Then I pointed 20 meters beyond where the old records stopped. The vein continued. Mr. No finally stopped treating me like a clown. He brought in a small drill rig. The first hole hit mineralized rock near the depth I had predicted. The second hit a thicker zone. The third hit something better. Not billionaire money, not a legendary discovery, but enough tungsten-bearing material to justify a serious exploration program. Daesung Minerals paid me a success bonus large enough that I checked my bank app 14 times. I had never seen that many zeros connected to my name without a minus sign nearby. Jisoo and I celebrated at an expensive barbecue restaurant. I ordered the best beef on the menu. He ordered 2 bottles of champagne, even though neither of us liked champagne. Halfway through dinner, I paused. He froze. By then he knew the expression. I had smelled something. Not danger, not metal. The waiter carrying our second bottle had accidentally stepped near a trash bag behind the building, and one microscopic droplet of rotten shellfish water had splashed onto his trouser cuff. I could smell it from across the room. That was when wealth taught me a cruel lesson. Money can buy premium beef, but it cannot stop your superhuman nose from detecting shrimp garbage during dinner. I stared at a steak worth more than my old monthly phone bill and whispered, very sincerely, "Screw this gift." The gift did not care. The next morning it became 1% stronger again. After the Daesung job, calls multiplied. Small exploration companies, construction firms, utility operators, environmental consultants, insurance investigators. One man who wanted me to find a wedding ring he had buried while drunk at a beach. I found the ring, 3 coins, a rusted zipper, 2 fishing weights, and a metal spoon that had no logical reason to be under half a meter of sand. The man cried over the ring. I became more interested in the spoon. Who buried it? Why? Was there soup involved? Was this a warning? Some mysteries should remain mysteries. Then came the scrapyard. A recycling company heard I could distinguish metal alloys and invited me to test a truckload of mixed scrap. Normally, they used scanners and sorting systems. I walked along the pile and started pointing. Copper wire under steel sheet. Brass fitting inside a broken pump. Aluminum alloy frame beneath a refrigerator door, stainless steel mixed with ordinary steel. Then I stopped beside an ugly chunk of blackened metal no bigger than my fist. It smelled wrong, dense, clean, resistant. A faint pattern I had only smelled once in Professor Han's sample cabinet. I asked where it came from. Nobody knew. They tested it. Tungsten alloy, worth far more than the yard had expected. I spent the next 4 hours recovering overlooked high-value metals from mountains of scrap. At the end of the day, the manager offered me a full-time job. I declined because there are limits to what a human nose should experience near compacted garbage. A week later, a jewelry dealer hired me to inspect a shipment of gold bracelets. The documents claimed high purity. I smelled them and immediately separated 6 pieces. The dealer asked what was wrong. I said the alloy content was different. Somewhere, a normal man my age was building a respectable resume. I was professionally inhaling dirt like a financially successful crackhead for mountains. Testing confirmed it. Then I noticed something else. One bracelet had a faint scent of machine oil, old paper, cedar, and a specific anti-tarnish compound I had encountered in vintage storage boxes. I asked whether the shipment was supposed to be newly manufactured. It was. That bracelet was decades old. The dealer investigated and uncovered a supplier quietly mixing old estate jewelry into supposedly new inventory. I got another bonus. By then my income had passed the point where my mother stopped asking whether I was looking for a real job. Instead, she asked why I still lived with Jisoo. The answer was simple. He paid half the rent and had already adapted to my insanity. Normal roommates do not accept statements like, "Don't open that window, somebody 4 buildings east is frying squid," or "Your left shoe has a battery smell." Jisoo would simply nod, close the window, and inspect his shoe. Once he asked whether I could smell lies. I told him no. He asked whether I was sure. I said yes. He immediately admitted he had broken my rice cooker 2 months earlier and blamed the electrical outlet. I threw a cushion at him. I could not smell lies, but apparently I could scare confessions out of idiots. The first time I smelled gold underground, actual natural gold, happened on day 237. Professor Han took me to a region known for old, small-scale gold workings. We were there to study how mineralized zones weathered near the surface. I expected to smell iron, sulfur, quartz, and traces of everything else. Instead, I caught that strange, quiet signature again. Gold, not jewelry, not a bar, not coins. Gold particles embedded in rock. The sensation was almost impossible to explain. Other minerals created scent patterns through oxidation, moisture, trace chemicals, microbes, dust, and surrounding reactions. Gold barely participated. That chemical stubbornness became its fingerprint. Against a noisy mineral background, it was a tiny pocket of silence. I followed it toward an exposed quartz vein. Professor Han chipped off samples. Laboratory analysis later confirmed elevated gold values. The concentration was not enough to make us rich, but that did not matter. I had done it. I could smell gold in the ground. I spent that evening sitting on my apartment floor with the laboratory report in my hands. Jisoo read it over my shoulder. He asked how much money the rock was worth. I said almost nothing. He asked why I looked like I had seen God. I told him because the point was not that rock. The point was what came next. If I could smell a tiny amount of gold in one quartz vein, then in another 100 days I would be several times better. In another year, dozens of times better. My ability did not have a known ceiling. Somewhere on Earth, mountains were hiding deposits worth billions. And every single morning, those mountains were getting worse at hiding from me. I should have been careful after that. My dignity had left the group chat months earlier, blocked all of us, and was probably living peacefully under an assumed name. I was not careful after that. The very next weekend, I rented a van, filled it with bottled water, hiking gear, sample bags, and snacks, then dragged Jisoo on what I called a recreational geology trip. He asked whether recreational geology was just hiking with worse fashion. I said yes. We drove to an old mining district where dozens of tiny abandoned workings dotted the hills. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous. We stayed on public trails and land where collecting small surface samples was allowed. I wanted to practice recognizing mineralized ground without Professor Han standing behind me like an anxious science father. At sunrise, I stepped out of the van and inhaled. The entire valley unfolded in my mind. Wet granite to the north, iron-rich soil near a road cut, sulfur traces along a creek, old timber preservatives from collapsed mine structures, rusted machinery beneath weeds, a buried drainage pipe, 3 cigarette butts near a sign, somebody's instant noodles cooking at a campsite almost 2 kilometers away. Then I caught gold. Tiny, faint, real. I started walking. Jisoo followed with coffee and the exhausted loyalty of a man who had accepted that his best friend might sprint into a forest because a rock smelled expensive. The scent led to a narrow drainage channel below an old hillside. Gold particles had apparently weathered from somewhere higher and accumulated in sediment. I did not know whether there was a meaningful deposit. I only knew the stream bed smelled like microscopic money. We panned a little gravel. 3 tiny flakes appeared. Jisoo stared at them. Then he stared at my nose. Then, with perfect seriousness, he bowed to my face. I told him to stop. He whispered, "Great nose. Bless this humble servant with mortgage freedom." I kicked mud at him. The flakes were worth almost nothing, but they gave me another piece of the puzzle. Gold could move. Streams concentrated it. Soil carried traces downhill. Plants took up elements. Dust blew through valleys. Groundwater transported chemical clues. I did not need to smell a buried deposit directly if I could smell the fingerprints it left everywhere around itself. That was the moment my ability became horrifyingly useful. I started building scent maps. I would walk a grid across a property and record intensity, direction, soil type, moisture, vegetation, and mineral signatures. Professor Han helped convert my notes into something normal geologists could understand. We joked that I was a biological survey instrument. Then he made the mistake of calling me a portable analytical platform during a meeting. I immediately put portable analytical platform on a business card beneath my name. Jisoo added a logo of a nose wearing a hard hat. We printed 500. Professor Han refused to take one. Our first major client was Minho Resources, a mid-sized mining company with a copper exploration project that had already eaten 2 years and a horrifying amount of money. Their surveys suggested mineralization, but drilling results were inconsistent. They had magnetic maps, electrical data, geochemistry, satellite imagery, structural models, and enough PowerPoint slides to destroy a lesser civilization. At this stage, geology felt less like science and more like I was tongue-kissing the planet with my sinuses, which is a sentence I deeply regret creating. I had nostrils. The exploration manager, Director Kwon, clearly hated this arrangement. He was in his 40s, precise, skeptical, and spoke to me as if every word cost the company money. He explained that I was there as an experimental consultant, not a magician. I agreed. Then I asked if I could smell their drill core warehouse before going to the field. He frowned. Professor Han laughed. The warehouse contained thousands of meters of rock core stored in long boxes, each labeled with depth and drill hole information. To me, it was a buffet of underground history. I walked between the rows. Copper sulfides, iron, clay alteration, quartz, carbonate, sulfur, traces of molybdenum, different oxidation states, different moisture histories. Then I found a pattern. Several boxes from different drill holes shared a similar mineral scent even though the visible rock looked different. I asked where those intervals came from. Director Kwon pulled the records. They lined up along the edge of a zone his team had considered secondary. I smelled another box. Same pattern, stronger, then another. I told him his most interesting target might be offset from where they had been drilling. He said that was a serious claim. I said his serious claim smelled like wet batteries and spicy pennies. That did not help my credibility. But when we went to the field, the same scent appeared in soils and tiny rock fractures across one slope. I mapped it. Their geophysicists compared my map with old data and noticed a structural trend they had underweighted. Minho drilled where the scent peaked. The hole hit a thick copper-bearing zone. Nobody screamed when the core came up. Mining people are trained professionals. They tried to stay calm. Then the assays came back. Director Kwon called me at 6:14 in the morning. He said one word, interesting. That was apparently geologist language for holy shit, the nose goblin found it. Minho's legal department rewrote my consulting agreement within a week. My rate increased by a number that made Jisoo choke on tea. Then my face appeared in a business newspaper under the phrase unconventional exploration consultant. The photo was terrible. I looked like I had smelled the photographer's soul and found it disappointing. That article changed my life more than any viral video. Now serious companies called. Not all of them were mining companies. A luxury resort wanted me to locate groundwater on an island property because drilling random wells was expensive. I spent 2 days walking around smelling differences in vegetation, soil moisture, salts, and trace minerals. I pointed to 3 areas. 2 had usable groundwater at reasonable depths. The third contained water that was too salty. The resort paid me anyway because I had warned them before they drilled. A construction company asked me to inspect a tunnel route. I detected sulfur-rich rock, groundwater seepage, and one buried pocket of old old industrial waste that the paperwork had missed. A vineyard hired me to map subtle soil differences because someone had seen an interview where I mentioned limestone. I did not know anything about wine. The owner did not care. I walked through rows of grapes and described the soil beneath each section. The vineyard later adjusted irrigation and planted different varieties in several blocks. They sent me 12 bottles as thanks. I gave 10 to my mother. Jisoo and I opened one. I sniffed it and accidentally described 17 aroma compounds. The oak barrel treatment, the cleaning chemical used on one hose, and the faint rubber scent from a gasket at the bottling line. Jisoo looked at his glass, looked at me, and said I had somehow turned getting drunk into an absurd quality control audit. We drank beer instead. By day 365, I celebrated 1 full year since the first morning. My ability had become about 38 times stronger than it was at the start. The number sounded insane, but the lived experience was even stranger. Distance mattered less. Concentration mattered less. Barriers mattered less. If air moved through cracks, vents, soil, fabric, packaging, or porous material, information eventually reached me. I could smell a coin in a closed room before entering it. I could identify which apartment floor had a leaking drain while standing in the lobby. I could tell when a truck carrying diesel fuel had passed an intersection several minutes earlier. I could smell rain in a neighboring district. At the same time, I had learned to shut most things out. My brain created filters. Human smells faded into background unless I focused. Food did the same. Garbage, thankfully, became something I could mute. That filter saved my sanity. It also created the dumbest possible superpower side effect. Sometimes I forgot to turn it back on. Once I walked into a restaurant, ate half a bowl of soup, and realized I had muted food smells so completely that everything tasted like hot texture. Another time, I spent 20 minutes looking for my phone while it was in my jacket pocket because I had gotten used to finding electronics by scent and had unconsciously filtered out my own belongings. A superpower does not make you intelligent. It merely gives your stupidity better equipment. The first anniversary also brought me my strangest client yet. A television producer wanted me on a variety show where celebrities hid objects in a massive indoor sandpit, and I had to find them by smell. I refused. Then they told me the appearance fee. I discovered television was my passion. The show built a beach-sized sandbox in a studio. The hidden objects included a silver necklace, a gold ring, a steel key, a sealed bottle of perfume, a bag of coffee beans, a truffle, and 1 rubber duck because television producers are children with budgets. I found all 7. Then I found an 8th object nobody had hidden. If this power had come with a user manual, page 1 would have said, "Congratulations, dumbass. You can now be traumatized by molecules nobody else knows exist." There was a coin under the studio floor. The host thought I was joking. I pointed to a spot near the edge of the set. The crew removed a floor panel and found an old 10-1 coin trapped beneath it. The studio had been renovated 9 years earlier. The audience lost their minds. The clip went everywhere. Suddenly my business card logo was a meme. People drew my nose wearing crowns, sunglasses, miner helmets, wizard hats, and one tiny bikini I desperately wish had never been created. Someone made a plush toy shaped like my nose. It sold out. I received royalties. I had officially monetized my own nostrils as merchandise. Capitalism had reached a place God abandoned. The attention created problems too. Treasure hunters flooded my inbox asking me to find buried family gold, war relics, old coins, lost safes, and alleged pirate treasure. Most stories were nonsense. Some requests involved private land with questionable ownership. A few were clearly people hoping I would help locate valuables that did not belong to them. I refused anything legally messy. I liked money, but I liked sleeping indoors more. One request, however, was legitimate and irresistible. A coastal town was restoring an old merchant house that had belonged to the same family for generations. Historical letters mentioned emergency silver and gold hidden during a period of instability, but nobody knew whether it had ever been recovered. The property owner wanted the house searched before renovations. I arrived with Professor Han, Jisoo, a historian, and enough documentation to make the lawyers happy. The house smelled like old wood, paper, dust, stone foundation, metal nails, mouse trails, dried sea air, and decades of cooking smoke embedded in beams. I searched room by room. Nothing. Then I went outside. Near an old stone wall, I caught silver. Not much. I followed it to a corner of the courtyard. We excavated carefully and found 3 silver coins. The historian was excited. I was not. The letter mentioned gold. I kept smelling. There was something beneath the house, but not where anyone expected. The scent did not rise through the floor. It traveled sideways through a narrow drainage channel. I followed the airflow to an old well that had been sealed with stone decades earlier. Gold. Definitely gold. Strong. The restoration team opened the upper section of the well under controlled conditions. About 4 meters down, there was a small side cavity built into the masonry. Inside sat a ceramic jar wrapped in decayed cloth. The jar contained jewelry, old trade coins, and several small gold bars stamped with markings the historian had never seen before. Everyone stood around silently. Jisoo leaned toward me and whispered that my nose had just found the world's fanciest emergency piggy bank. The owner reported the discovery properly. Conservators took over, and I was paid a generous search fee. But the real effect was reputation. Until then, companies treated me like an unusual consultant. After the Merchant House discovery, people started talking about me like I was a human treasure radar. I was making executive-level money with an ability that visually looked identical to a dog checking whether another dog had pissed on a mailbox. That phrase followed me everywhere. I hated it because radar sounded elegant. My actual process still involved closing one nostril sometimes and turning my head like a confused Labrador. Then a billionaire called. His name was Chairman Hwang, founder of Surin Metals, one of the largest mining groups in the country. He invited me to dinner at a private restaurant on the top floor of a tower. I wore my best suit. Jisoo tied my tie because I had somehow become a geological celebrity without learning how to tie one properly. Chairman Hwang was 71, perfectly calm, and built like a man who had never raised his voice because entire departments panicked when he cleared his throat. He placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside were 5 identical stone samples. He told me one came from a mine his company had purchased decades earlier. The other 4 were similar-looking controls. I smelled them. One carried faint gold, arsenic-related mineralization, quartz, and a particular alteration pattern. I pointed to it. Correct. Then he placed a second box on the table. 10 rocks. I pointed to 2. Correct again. Then he smiled and asked whether I could do the same thing if the rock was still underground. I told him that depended on depth, geology, airflow, water movement, and concentration. He asked what my current maximum range was. I said I had never found it. That was when Chairman Hwang slid a folder across the table. Surin Metals owned exploration rights to a huge stretch of mountainous land overseas. Decades of surveys had identified several possible targets, but the terrain was difficult, and drilling would cost millions. He wanted me to spend 10 days there. The consulting fee printed on the first page was larger than everything I had earned in my life combined. I tried to maintain a professional expression. Inside my head, a tiny version of me was naked, screaming, and doing backflips through a rainstorm of cash. I signed after Professor Han and a lawyer reviewed the contract. 3 weeks later, I stepped off a helicopter into a landscape so enormous that my previous job suddenly felt like smelling coins under a couch. Mountains stretched in every direction. No city smells. No restaurants. No traffic. Just stone, vegetation, water, wind, soil, and the deep mineral breath of the earth. I inhaled. And for the first time in my life, I smelled something so large that I forgot to exhale. It was copper. Not a vein. Not a loose boulder. Not one interesting patch of soil. Something enormous was influencing the entire valley. The scent came through groundwater, weathered rock, dust, tiny sulfur compounds, iron oxides, plant roots, and microscopic particles carried downslope. Each clue was weak by itself. Together they formed a shape in my head so broad that I felt like I had accidentally opened a map nobody else could see. I pointed toward a mountain on the other side of the valley. Chairman Hwang's exploration director, Ms. Yoon, raised an eyebrow. That mountain was not one of their top targets. I asked for a map. She unfolded a geological sheet across the hood of a truck. Their strongest anomalies were south and west. The mountain I had pointed towards sat at the edge of an area previously ranked low priority. I smelled the wind again. Copper-related mineralization, sulfur, molybdenum traces, potassium alteration, magnetite, clay. Something deep and hot in the geological past had cooked that mountain from the inside. I had learned enough geology by then to recognize the possibility. A large porphyry system. Maybe. I told them to fly me closer. 10 minutes later, I was in a helicopter trying not to vomit while simultaneously acting like the world's least dignified airborne survey instrument. Every time the aircraft banked, my stomach attempted a hostile takeover. I kept one hand on a sick bag and the other pointing towards stronger scent zones. Ms. Yoon asked if I was okay. I told her the mountains smelled fantastic and aviation could eat my ass. That sentence was apparently not in the consultant handbook. We landed on a ridge. The scent became stronger. There were altered rocks at the surface, but nothing so obvious that a normal person would scream treasure. I walked downhill, stopped, doubled back, then walked east. My nose built invisible contours. Strong here, weaker there. Strong again farther north. I spent 2 days covering the mountain while a field team sampled behind me. On the third morning, I stood on a barren patch of ground and smelled something that made every hair on my arms rise. Gold, copper, molybdenum, not rich gold by itself, but distributed through the same giant system. I told Ms. Yoon the center was deeper than their shallow surface work suggested. My best guess was that the most interesting zone sat beneath an area nobody had drilled. She did not celebrate. She ordered verification. That was why I respected her. A nose could be wrong. Even mine. They ran additional geophysics, resampled old data, and positioned 2 drill rigs. The first hole went down for days. I had never experienced geological suspense before. It is unbelievably stupid. You spend millions of won making a rotating metal tube chew through a mountain, while everyone stands around pretending they are not emotionally dependent on cylindrical rocks. When the core from the target depth came out, I smelled copper before the box reached the logging table. Ms. Yoon saw the visible mineralization and finally smiled. The hole continued, and continued, and continued. Mineralized rock kept appearing. The second drill hole hit it too. Assays eventually confirmed a large mineralized system with grades promising enough to justify a massive new program. It was not automatically a mine. Years of work would still be required. Economics, permits, engineering, metallurgy, infrastructure, environmental studies, all the boring adult things mountains demand before becoming money. But Sioran's internal estimate of the project's potential value jumped into numbers I refused to say out loud because they sounded fake. The corporate world had somehow decided the smartest person in the room was the bastard breathing suspiciously near the rocks, which should worry everyone about capitalism. Chairman Huang called me personally. He asked what I wanted as a bonus. I had prepared for this question with a lawyer, so naturally when the moment came, my brain deleted every professional sentence I had rehearsed. I looked at Jisoo, who was sitting across the hotel room eating chips, and said I wanted enough money to stop checking menu prices before ordering. There was silence on the phone. Then Chairman Huang laughed. I got the contractual bonus plus an additional performance payment. I also got a Sioran corporate card for travel expenses, which was a terrible idea because Jisoo discovered airport lounges. He treated free lounge dumplings like revenge against the global financial system. Our return flight had a connection. During the layover, I found him at a buffet table with 3 plates. I asked whether he planned to eat all of it. He said, "Minho, rich people have been stealing from me my whole life." He was 23 and unemployed by choice. I asked what exactly rich people had stolen from him. He pointed at a tiny imported cheese and said, "This, probably." I left him there. The Sioran job made me internationally known inside the exploration industry. Outside that industry, I was still the guy from the meme with the hard hat nose. Inside it, executives started saying my name in meetings. Companies sent proposals from Australia, Canada, Chile, Peru, South Africa, Indonesia, and places I had never visited. Gold projects, copper projects, lithium brines, nickel, rare earth elements, diamonds, groundwater, geothermal exploration, even helium. I needed help, so I formed a company. We called it Olfacta Exploration because Professor Han said investors would take a Latin-sounding name more seriously than Jisoo's suggestion, Sniff Rich Incorporated. Jisoo remained offended. He became operations manager anyway. Professor Han became scientific advisor. Ms. Yoon introduced me to a retired exploration geologist named Mr. Choi, who joined as technical director after confirming I was not a scam. We hired 2 field geologists, 1 data analyst, 1 lawyer, and an accountant who spent his first week asking why the company expense sheet included 6,000 scented sample jars. Those jars became our secret weapon. Every project added to my scent library, or samples, soils, alteration minerals, groundwater, drill cuttings, core, concentrates, tailings, processing chemicals. Different deposits had different signatures. 2 gold systems could smell nothing alike because their geology was different, but patterns repeated in families. My brain adapted faster than our database. At day 400, I could smell distinctions I did not have names for. I would hand a geologist 2 samples and say, "These are related, but this one came from hotter fluids and interacted with more carbonate." They would run tests. I would be right often enough to make everyone uncomfortable. At day 450, I discovered I could smell depth indirectly, not actual distance like a ruler. I detected how scent traveled through fractures, moisture, temperature gradients, soil gas, and weathered layers. A shallow target felt sharp and immediate. A deep one arrived softened, mixed, delayed, filtered through the geology above it. I kept waiting for reality to slap me and say the joke was over, but reality seemed busy snorting powdered nonsense off the ass of probability. Mr. Choi created blind tests using buried sample containers at known depths. I estimated them 1 meter, 3 meters, 8 meters, 12 meters. Then he included a sample in a borehole more than 50 meters down. I found it. He stopped smiling. By then, nobody on my team laughed when my nose did something impossible. They just added it to a spreadsheet. Our next major contract involved lithium brines beneath a salt flat. I had never smelled a salt flat before. Imagine an ocean died, got cremated by the sun, and left behind enough mineral crust to season a continent. Salt attacked my nose from every direction. Sodium, magnesium, potassium, boron, sulfates, chlorides, dust, brine. The lithium itself was difficult. I was not literally smelling naked lithium atoms floating around. I was learning the combined chemical fingerprint of brines with different compositions and how those fluids interacted with surrounding sediments. The client had already drilled several wells with mixed results. They wanted help finding where richer brine might be concentrated. I spent 3 days walking and driving transects. The surface looked almost identical for kilometers, but underneath, the fluid chemistry changed. I could smell it. One zone had higher magnesium, which complicated processing. Another smelled like a more favorable brine signature. A third contained much fresher water entering from the basin edge. We recommended test locations. The best well-returned stronger lithium concentrations than the client's previous average. Their project manager shook my hand and asked how I did it. I gave him a 20-minute explanation involving fluid pathways, evaporite chemistry, trace aerosols, and hypersensitive olfaction. He listened carefully. Then he said, "So you sniffed the salt." I hated him because he was correct. Another client flew us to an old diamond district. Diamonds themselves were not the useful scent target. Indicator minerals were. Kimberlite-related rocks carried distinctive combinations of minerals and weathering products. My job was to search a huge area where soil cover made mapping difficult. We drove for hours. I smelt dust until my mouth tasted like a driveway. Then, near a dry stream bed, I caught a pattern from our training samples. Chromium-rich minerals, magnesium, weathered ultramafic rock, something unusual upstream. I followed it like a bloodhound chasing geology's least exciting murder suspect. The trail led to a patch of deeply weathered ground with subtle rock fragments. Sampling later confirmed indicator minerals worth investigating. The company loved it. Jisoo hated it because he had spent the day holding bags while I walked in circles. That evening he announced that my superpower had turned him into the Watson of dirt. I told him Watson was a doctor and a war veteran. He looked at the backpack full of soil samples and said, "Then I'm the bitch carrying Sherlock's rocks." We put that on a mug too. Olfacta exploration grew faster than I expected. Within 6 months we were turning down more work than we accepted. I refused to become a circus act companies could rent by the hour, so we created a process. Clients had to provide geological information. We worked with their teams. We documented targets. We insisted on verification. That made the results harder to dismiss as magic. It also made me more dangerous to lazy executives. One company invited us to a gold project and expected me to bless their favorite drilling target. The CEO had already told investors that a major discovery was likely. His geologists were less confident. I walked the property. His favorite hill smelled like ordinary granite with weak alteration and disappointment. Another valley 2 kilometers away smelled far more interesting. He pressured me to support the hill. I refused. He offered a larger fee. I refused again. Then he asked whether I understood how much money was riding on the announcement. I told him I understood exactly. That was why I would not let him use my nose as a corporate Ouija board. We left. 3 months later, his company drilled the hill anyway. Bad results. Their stock dropped. 6 months after that, new management tested the valley we had recommended. Better results. Mr. Choi printed the news release and taped it to our office refrigerator. Jisoo drew a nose on it wearing sunglasses. Professionalism remained a distant dream. The biggest change came when I learned to smell from the air. Helicopter flights were expensive and still made me nauseous, so one client used a slow fixed-wing survey plane. They wanted me to test whether airborne dust and gases could reveal broad mineral patterns. At 1,000 meters above rugged terrain, I expected nothing useful. Instead, the wind became a massive conveyor belt. Valleys exhaled. Ridges shed dust. Vegetation released chemicals tied to soil and moisture. Groundwater seeps fed streams whose aerosols drifted upward. Mining areas smelled different from untouched ground. Rock types separated into broad zones. Alteration systems appeared as faint stains in the air. I sat beside the window with my eyes closed and called directions while our data analyst marked the GPS track. After 2 hours, I had drawn several invisible scent corridors across the map. One crossed a target area the client already knew. Another did not. They investigated the second one later. It contained previously unmapped alteration. That was when our competitors got scared. I knew because one of them tried to hire my entire team. A giant multinational called Atlas Crown Resources offered Mr. Choi triple his salary. They offered our data analyst 4 times hers. They even contacted Jisoo, which was hilarious because his primary technical qualifications were buying plane tickets, carrying snacks, and yelling at printers. He forwarded me their offer with one message. They think I'm important. I'm framing this. Nobody left. Then Atlas Crown's vice president invited me to dinner. He offered to acquire olfacta exploration. There is no MBA course for explaining why a grown man is worth millions because his nostrils have better analytics than a satellite. And frankly, that is education's spectacular failure. The number had 9 digits in dollars. I thought it was a typo. It was not. For a few seconds, I imagined selling. I could retire before 25, buy my mother a house, buy myself 3 houses, buy Jisoo a small island and leave him there when he annoyed me. Then I smelled the vice president's pen, not metaphorically, literally. The metal pen in his hand had a faint residue of drilling mud and sulfide-rich dust. He had recently visited one of their exploration sites. I asked which project. He paused. Then he named a gold project Atlas Crown had been struggling with for years. Without thinking, I asked whether the northern ridge contained arsenic-rich sulfides. His face changed. He asked how I knew. I pointed to the pen. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. They increased the offer. I still refused, because by then I understood the real value was not what my company had already found. It was what my nose would become. At 2 years, the compounding would make my ability more than 1,000 times sharper than it had been that first morning. I was only halfway there, and I had started noticing scents that did not belong to anything on the surface at all. The first one was heat. That sounds impossible because heat does not have a smell. Except I was not smelling heat. I was smelling what heat did to everything around it. Warm groundwater dissolved minerals differently. Hot rock changed gases. Deep fractures carried sulfur compounds, carbon dioxide, trace metals, and chemical signatures from places sunlight had never touched. At first, those signals were too faint to separate from ordinary ground. Then one morning, they were not. A geothermal developer hired us to inspect a volcanic region where they hoped to drill production wells. They already had temperature gradient data and geophysical surveys. I was supposed to help identify fracture zones where hot fluids might circulate. The site smelled like rotten eggs had founded a nation. Sulfur everywhere. Steam vents. Mineral pools. Wet rock. Clay. Volcanic gases. I nearly turned around. Then I focused. Background sulfur faded. Individual gas mixtures separated. One fracture zone carried hotter, deeper chemistry. Another was mostly shallow steam. A third had strong mineral deposition clogging its pathways. I mapped the differences and pointed toward a slope where hot fluids seemed to rise through a buried fault. The company drilled there. Good temperature, good permeability, strong flow. Their reservoir engineer hugged me. I was wearing a hard hat and holding a gas mask, so the hug looked like 2 badly designed action figures colliding. Jisoo filmed it. The clip became an office sticker titled "When the Hole is Hotter Than Expected." Our human resources consultant saw the sticker, closed her eyes, and asked why she had taken this job. I reminded her we paid above market. She said money was the only thing standing between us and total organizational collapse. She was also correct. The geothermal job made me curious about deep gases, so Professor Han arranged controlled studies with researchers. I smelled samples collected from boreholes at different depths. I learned the signatures of methane, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, helium-bearing gases, hydrocarbon mixtures, and dozens of trace compounds. Soon I could tell whether groundwater had interacted with limestone, volcanic rock, sulfides, or organic-rich sediments. Then I found a gas leak no instrument had detected yet. Not because the instruments were bad, because the leak had not reached the sensor locations. We were visiting an industrial site when I smelled a tiny hydrocarbon signature beneath a concrete service area. I stopped and asked whether any buried lines ran there. The plant manager said yes. They shut down the section and pressure tested the line. A seal had begun failing. The leak was small, contained, and caught early. That incident got me invited to speak at an engineering conference. I made the mistake of attending. 500 engineers watched me explain how my nose worked. A man in the front row asked for the detection limit in parts per billion. I told him I no longer knew. Another asked whether humidity affected sensitivity. Yes. Another asked about temperature. Yes. Another asked if repeated exposure caused olfactory fatigue. Usually, but my adaptation seemed abnormal. Then a professor asked whether I had tried smelling neutrinos. The room laughed. I laughed too. 3 years later, that joke would stop being funny. but at the time I had standards. After the conference, a museum curator approached me with a completely different problem. Their natural history museum had received an old private collection containing several suspected meteorites. Some were genuine, some were ordinary rocks people had picked up because they looked weird. Could I help sort them before laboratory testing? Meteorites fascinated me because they did not smell like normal Earth rocks. Their metal composition, oxidation products, fusion crust, weathering history, and trace chemistry created unfamiliar patterns. One iron meteorite smelled like nickel, iron, desert dust, and something my brain categorized as cold old sky, which was scientifically useless but emotionally accurate. I identified 4 likely meteorites out of 30 samples. 3 were confirmed. The 4th was even stranger. It was terrestrial slag from an old furnace. I apologized. The curator was thrilled anyway because the slag itself had historical value. Jisoo asked if that counted as losing to medieval garbage. I told him to shut up. A month later, a farmer in a rural area contacted the museum about a heavy metallic object found when digging a drainage ditch. The curator invited me along. The object was a meteorite fragment, but when I smelled the field around it, I detected more iron-nickel material underground. We mapped the area. Several fragments were recovered, all legally documented with the landowner. Then I smelled something much deeper. A larger mass. The excavation crew dug carefully. At nearly 3 meters, they uncovered a meteorite chunk so heavy it required machinery to lift. The farmer became locally famous. I became the man who could apparently smell space rocks through dirt. Internet comments immediately asked whether I could smell aliens. I made one video saying no. It received 2 million views. The top comment said, "Bro hasn't unlocked alien pussy detection yet. Give him 300 days." I deleted the app for an afternoon. Then I reinstalled it because our company marketing team needed me to approve a post. Fame was exhausting. Fortunately, money was soothing. By then I had bought my mother a house. A normal house, not a ridiculous mansion. She cried when I handed her the keys, then immediately complained that the kitchen cabinets were too high. I offered to renovate them. She said not to waste money. 20 minutes later, she asked whether I could smell if the neighbor's roof was leaking. Superpowers do not protect you from mothers. I bought myself an apartment too, mostly because our original place had become unbearable for storage. Jisoo moved into the unit next door instead of getting his own life. He claimed it was efficient for operations. I claimed he was a parasite with excellent Wi-Fi. He claimed parasites did not negotiate hotel discounts. Fair. The new apartment had one room converted into a scent lab with sealed cabinets, controlled ventilation, reference samples, and filters. We stored hundreds of mineral specimens and chemical standards there. I could now blind identify most of them instantly. Gold remained my favorite, the quiet scent, the absence. At around day 600, I realized I could estimate gold concentration from surface clues. Not perfectly. Geology was too complex. But if 2 soil samples came from the same system, I could usually tell which one had interacted with more gold-bearing material. With training data, my guesses became unnervingly good. Atlas Crown heard about this. They called again. This time, they did not try to buy us. They wanted to hire us. Their difficult gold project had become more difficult. Years of drilling showed scattered high-grade zones, but no clear pattern. Millions had been spent chasing them. The project was turning into what Mr. Choi called a geological slot machine. I accepted for an obscene consulting fee and the childish satisfaction of making the company that tried to buy me pay retail. Their project was remote, mountainous, and covered by thick forest. Surface exposure was terrible. Perfect. I walked into the first valley and immediately smelled mineralization. Gold, yes, but not evenly distributed. Sulfides formed narrow structural zones. Arsenic-related signatures varied sharply. Quartz veins cut across different rock types. Faults had redirected fluids. Their existing model assumed one major trend. My nose suggested at least 3. I spent 8 days walking ridges and stream valleys. Every evening, our team overlaid my scent map with drilling data. Patterns emerged. The best gold intersections were not random. They clustered where 2 scent corridors crossed. Mr. Choi nearly vibrated out of his chair. Atlas Crown drilled 1 intersection. Good result. Then another. Better result. Then a third. The third core contained a narrow but extremely rich gold zone. My nose had become so valuable that losing it to a doorframe would have been the dumbest financial disaster since someone bought digital monkey pictures at the top. Their vice president stared at the core box for a long time. Then he looked at me and asked whether I still refused to sell the company. I said yes. He asked whether I would consider selling just my nose. I asked what the medical procedure would be. He stopped asking. Jisoo later said we should have negotiated because I had 2 nostrils and could probably lease one. I reminded him both nostrils were attached to the same face. He said that sounded like an engineering problem. This is why he was not technical director. The Atlas Crown project brought us into the world of abandoned mines. Old mining land fascinated me. Historical miners often followed visible veins and stopped when technology, economics, flooding, or bad luck defeated them. Modern exploration could find extensions they never knew existed. My nose loved old mines because decades of exposed rock gave me scent access to deeper structures. We never entered unsafe tunnels. I did not need to. Standing near a sealed adit, I could smell air leaking from underground fractures and ventilation pathways. It carried mineral signatures from inside. One abandoned silver mine smelled like a metal orchestra. Lead, zinc, silver-related mineralization, sulfur, wet timber, rust, groundwater. But deeper in the airflow, I caught something unexpected. Gold. Historical records described the mine as mostly silver lead zinc. We sampled waste rock and nearby veins. Some contained minor gold values. A modern exploration company later drilled beneath the old workings and found a separate gold-bearing structure. Not a giant discovery, but enough to prove the concept. Suddenly, every company with an old mine wanted my nose near it. For 3 months, I became the patron saint of holes people had stopped digging. I visited abandoned tin mines, old copper prospects, closed coal workings, forgotten quarries, and one mine museum where the guide refused to believe I could smell ore until I identified which display case contained a hidden chunk of galena. At lunch, I accidentally detected a silver coin inside an old vending machine that had been unplugged for years. The museum staff opened it. There were 17 coins jammed behind the mechanism. The curator laughed so hard he had to sit down. I asked whether I got a finder's fee. He gave me a free refrigerator magnet. I had helped locate mineral targets worth millions, and yet somehow that magnet remains one of my favorite payments. Then came the buried safe. A family renovating an old countryside hotel found documents showing that the founder had hidden a strongbox somewhere on the property decades earlier. The founder was dead. The safe belonged to the family. They had searched basements, walls, gardens, and outbuildings with detectors. Nothing. I arrived expecting gold or steel. Instead, I smelled lead. Old safes sometimes used thick metal layers and fire-resistant materials. The lead signature came from beneath a greenhouse. We removed planters, lifted pavers, and found disturbed soil. About a meter down sat a corroded steel chest with lead lining. Inside were old documents, cash no longer usable, jewelry, and 6 bottles of extremely expensive vintage liquor. The family cheered. I did not. One bottle had leaked slightly. I could smell 80-year-old alcohol from outside the safe. The scent was so complex my brain briefly attempted to provide tasting notes for dirt. Jisoo asked if the ground was full-bodied. I told him it had hints of oak, mineral, and shut the hell up. The hotel owner gave us one intact bottle after confirming it could legally be transferred. I never opened it. I put it in a cabinet labeled soil wine just to annoy Jisoo. Our office culture continued deteriorating. Meanwhile, my power kept climbing. Every morning, 1%, no breaks, no plateaus. At day 700, I could stand on a hill and smell groundwater moving through fractures tens or possibly hundreds of meters below, depending on conditions. I could detect ore-related gases that ordinary instruments would need careful sampling to measure. I could smell the difference between freshly exposed rock and rock fractured deep underground, then carried upward by fault gases. At day 720, just before the 2-year mark, I stood outside our office during a rainstorm and suddenly smelled gold. Not nearby, far away, very far. I turned north. The scent appeared for only a second, carried by wind and rain. Then it vanished. I checked nearby construction sites, jewelry stores, industrial sources, everything obvious. Nothing matched. The next day, the wind came from the same direction. I smelled it again. Gold, arsenic-rich sulfides, wet granite, forest soil, and old mine waste. I opened a map. There was an abandoned gold district more than 40 kilometers north of the city. I stared at the screen. 40 kilometers. Jisoo asked what was wrong. I told him I could smell an old mining district from our office. He looked out the window, then back at me. For once, he did not make a joke. Then he slowly opened his phone calculator. 2 years of 1% compounding had pushed my nose to roughly 1,400 times its starting sensitivity. Jisoo showed me the number. I showed him the map. He whispered, "Dude." I nodded, because we both understood the same thing. Until then, companies had flown me to exploration sites. Soon, I might not need to go to the site at all. I tested the 40-kilometer smell because apparently self-control had left my body. We rented a van and drove north with portable weather instruments, maps, and Professor Han, who had reached the stage of his career where supernatural nonsense no longer surprised him before coffee. Every 5 kilometers we stopped. I smelled. The signature grew stronger. At 30 kilometers, I could separate old mine waste from natural mineralization. At 20, I could tell that the historic district contained several different alteration zones. At 10, the mountain smelled so distinct that I could follow its mineralized structures from the roadside without seeing them. Every new ability felt like opening a loot box designed by a horny geologist with no adult supervision and unlimited access to the laws of nature. When we finally reached the abandoned workings, I walked straight to the slope I had been detecting from the city. Professor Han checked the maps. It was one of the district's old gold-bearing zones. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Jisoo took out his phone and updated our company website. Under services, he added regional sniffing. Our lawyer made him remove it. He added it back under research. The lawyer threatened him with physical violence. I considered both positions reasonable. Long-range detection completely changed how we worked. Instead of starting inside a known project area, I could begin from high ground dozens of kilometers away, especially when weather conditions were favorable. Winds carried dust and gases. River systems carried dissolved clues. Valleys funneled air. Storm fronts stirred everything together. I learned to use weather maps like a fisherman. Strong crosswinds were annoying. Stable valley breezes were useful. Rain could either wash scents out or amplify wet soil chemistry. Snow muted some signals but sharpened others by suppressing surface odors. One winter project became so clean that the landscape smelled like a geological blueprint. We were searching for nickel-copper mineralization in a cold northern region. Most vegetation was buried beneath snow. Surface biological smells were faint. The air was brutally crisp. I stood on a frozen ridge, inhaled, and detected a sulfide signature carried from several valleys away. We drove toward it. The scent strengthened near an area mapped as mafic rock. Then another odor appeared. Iron, magnesium-rich minerals, sulfur, and subtle nickel-related chemistry. I marked 3 zones. One was worthless. One had weak mineralization. The third turned into a serious target after geophysical follow-up that reminded everyone, especially me, that my nose was not an oracle. It detected chemistry. Chemistry still had to be interpreted. I could smell gold and still find only tiny traces. I could smell copper and discover a concentration too low to mine. I could smell diamonds indicator minerals and find no diamonds. This was important because the internet had started treating me like a walking money printer. People sent messages asking why I did not simply smell the nearest $1 trillion and retire. Because Earth is a cheap bastard. It hides valuable atoms inside billions of tons of ordinary rock, under deserts, beneath oceans, behind permits, inside mountains, and occasionally under land owned by a farmer who does not want anyone touching his goats. Finding something and being allowed to monetize it were different sports. Also, I liked the game. Every project gave my brain new scents to solve. I returned to truffles for fun. Chairman Bake invited me back to the same forest where my career had started. Napoleon the pig was still working. He was bigger. I was stronger. The moment I stepped out of the car, Napoleon recognized me. I swear he did. He made a low sound and scraped one hoof against the dirt. Chairman Bake laughed and said the pig had never forgotten the humiliation. This time I could smell truffles from the parking area. Dozens, possibly hundreds. Their earthy scent was bright against the soil. I could estimate depth. I could separate immature truffles from mature ones. I could smell where fungal networks spread between roots. I found the first truffle before Napoleon reached the trees. Then I deliberately waited. The pig found one. I applauded. Napoleon glared at me. I found another 50 meters away. He charged, not at the truffle, at me. I ran downhill with a billionaire restaurant owner, 3 chefs, and 2 truffle hunters screaming with laughter behind us while a furious pig defended the dignity of animal labor. I escaped by jumping over a low fence. Napoleon stopped on the other side and stared at me like he wanted to drag me before the Hague for crimes against swine. I sent Chairman Bake a basket of apples as a peace offering. He said Napoleon ate them. We were not friends. That ridiculous day became my most viewed video of the year. It also reminded me why I had started enjoying the ability. Not everything needed to be a $1 billion deposit. Sometimes a supernatural nose was useful for being chased by a pig on camera. Then I got invited to a beach cleanup event. That sounds unrelated to mining. It was not. Volunteers were removing trash from a coastline after storms had exposed old debris. I joined because the organizers wanted publicity and because my company sponsored environmental work around some exploration areas. Within 20 minutes, I was finding buried metal under sand faster than the detector teams. Fishing weights, coins, aluminum cans, rusted tools, a stainless watch, a gold chain. The gold chain belonged to nobody we could identify, so it went through the proper lost property process. Then I smelled something deeper. Heavy metal, bronze, copper, iron, old wood preserved in wet sediment. I followed the signature toward a section of beach near low tide. There, beneath layers of sand, was a concentration of old metal objects. The archaeologists got involved before anyone dug further. It turned out to be remains from a historical wreck site already suspected to exist somewhere along that coast. Storms had shifted sediment enough for my nose to catch corroded metal signatures. I was not allowed to excavate, which was fine because I knew absolutely nothing about underwater archaeology and preferred not to become the idiot who sneezed on a national treasure. The media headline, however, became "Human Nose Locates Lost Shipwreck." That was not entirely true, but truth had never defeated a clickable headline. Gishu printed it and taped it beside the refrigerator article. Our office fridge had become a shrine to journalistic exaggeration. 1 week later, I smelled another ship. This one was not historical. We were taking a ferry to an island project when I caught a sharp electrical odor from below deck. Heated insulation, ozone, battery chemistry. I alerted the crew. They found an overheating electrical component in a service compartment and shut it down before it became a bigger problem. The captain thanked me. The passengers thanked me. Jisoo asked whether I could please stop discovering things on transportation because he wanted one normal trip. I promised nothing. At the island, our client was searching for rare earth mineralization in old volcanic rocks. Rare earth elements were tricky because, again, I was not smelling pure elements. I detected associated minerals, weathering products, clays, iron oxides, phosphate minerals, and trace chemical patterns from our sample library. The island had steep jungle, bad roads, and insects that considered my blood a premium subscription service. I hated every mosquito personally. By the second day, my legs looked like bubble wrap. Jisoo handed me repellent. I smelled the formula and complained that one solvent had oxidized in the bottle. He stared at my bites and said, "Your nose can smell gold through a mountain but can't smell that you're getting raw-dogged by mosquitoes?" I threw the bottle at him. The exploration results were better than my dignity. I identified a broad alteration zone that differed from surrounding rock. Soil samples later showed elevated rare earth indicators. The company opened a new target area. Then the island's mayor asked whether I could help find an old freshwater spring described in local records. The spring had supposedly been buried by a landslide decades earlier. During dry seasons, the village imported water by truck. I walked the hillside. Groundwater had its own scent map now. Carbonate content, dissolved minerals, vegetation stress, soil moisture, microbial gases, temperature. One part of the slope smelled cooler and fresher beneath layers of clay. We drilled a shallow test hole. Water, not a giant aquifer, but a steady flow from fractured rock. The village later developed it properly. That job paid almost nothing. It felt better than some of the giant corporate bonuses. Naturally, Jisoo ruined the moment by telling a reporter I was Aquaman if his only power was aggressive nasal analysis. The quote got published. I stopped letting him near journalists. By my third year, companies began booking my schedule almost a year in advance. My rates became absurd because demand was more absurd. A major survey campaign could cost millions before drilling even started. If 3 days of my time helped eliminate bad targets, my fee was rounding error. Some executives understood that immediately. Others tried to negotiate. One mining CEO told me my daily rate was higher than his. I told him his sense of smell was worse than mine. He stared at me. I stared back. He signed. The financial side became so weird that our accountant forced me into a meeting about personal wealth management. He explained diversification, taxes, trusts, insurance, and investment strategy. I listened seriously for 40 minutes. Then I smelt that his expensive leather briefcase contained a banana. I asked why. He looked offended. He said blood sugar. I asked whether the banana was overripe. He said no. I said it was approximately 4 hours from entering the dangerous zone. He put it on the table and resumed talking about bonds. This was my life now. At 3 years, my compounding sensitivity had become tens of thousands of times stronger than that first strange morning. Distance stopped behaving normally. On clear nights when cities cooled and air layers settled, I could detect industrial zones far beyond the horizon, refineries, ports, steel mills, chemical plants, large forests, coastal salt, mountain snow. The world had become a scent atlas. Then, during a flight back from a project, I smelled gold from 30,000 feet. I thought I was imagining it. We were cruising above a vast mountain region. The cabin air was recirculated and filtered, but tiny amounts of outside air still entered through aircraft systems. My nose caught a mineral signature so faint that it should not have existed. Gold-related alteration. Copper. Sulfur. Dust. I looked out the window. Clouds covered half the landscape. I pulled up the flight map. We were passing over a famous mining belt. That alone could explain it. Then the scent sharpened somewhere east of the known mines. I pressed my face closer to the air vent like an idiot. A flight attendant asked if something was wrong. I said no. Jisoo, from the next seat, said, "He's just smelling the damn continental crust again." The flight attendant walked away without asking another question. I marked the coordinates. Months later, satellite data and public geological maps showed promising rock units in that general area. We had no mineral rights there and no reason to pursue it. Still, I saved the point. It was the first location in a private file I named Impossible Smells. The second location appeared 2 weeks later. I woke up at 4:03 in the morning because I smelled gold from my bedroom. Not jewelry in the building. Not a nearby store. Not anything local. A distant, massive signature arrived on a dry wind from the west. Gold, iron oxide, silica, sulfur, desert dust. I stood on my balcony in pajamas, eyes closed, turning my head degree by degree. The scent vanished when the wind shifted. I checked weather data. The air mass had traveled hundreds of kilometers. That should have destroyed any useful signal. But my nose had become so sensitive that destroyed apparently meant slightly inconvenient. I opened a regional map. There were known gold districts upwind. There were also huge areas with little modern exploration. I added a second point to Impossible Smells. Then I went back to bed. 5 minutes later, I sat up again, because mixed into the gold signature had been something I had never smelled in any sample before. Something metallic, heavy, deep, and very, very old. The unknown scent bothered me for 6 days. I checked every reference sample we had: iron meteorites, nickel ores, platinum minerals, cobalt ores, uranium minerals handled under controlled museum conditions from a distance, industrial alloys, slags, catalysts. Nothing matched exactly. Professor Han told me to describe it without naming it. Dense metal association, extremely low chemical reactivity in parts of the signature, ultramafic rock, sulfides, iron, nickel, something that reminded me of meteorites. Mr. Choi stopped chewing his lunch. Platinum group elements, possibly. Platinum, palladium, rhodium, and related metals often occurred with nickel copper sulfides or unusual layered igneous systems. I had smelled refined platinum before, but never a natural deposit rich enough for the whole geological package to register at extreme distance. We traced the wind history backward. The air mass had crossed a region containing old mafic and ultramafic rocks. Some mapped, some poorly explored. Olfacta did not own rights there. A small local company did. We contacted them. At first they thought it was a prank. Then they searched my name. 3 days later, their CEO was on a video call wearing a tie over what was clearly a hiking shirt. He explained that they had been exploring for nickel but had limited funding. Old samples showed anomalous platinum and palladium in places. Nothing conclusive. I asked for sealed duplicates of their drill cuttings and soils. They couriered them. The moment I opened the first approved container in our lab, the mystery scent returned. Same family, much stronger. I nearly headbutted the table. We negotiated an unusual deal. Instead of a giant consulting fee the small company could not afford, Olfacta received a future royalty on any discovery directly tied to our targets. Our lawyer loved the structure. Our accountant developed a stress twitch. We flew out. The property was enormous and mostly empty. Rolling hills, exposed dark rocks, scrub vegetation, long dirt roads, the kind of place where a flat tire becomes a philosophical event. The first morning, I climbed a hill and smelled the mystery signature in 3 directions. One was weak, one followed, known nickel mineralization. The third made my brain light up. I walked toward it for 6 hours. Jisoo rode in the truck and occasionally leaned out the window to ask if I remembered vehicles had been invented. I ignored him because the scent kept strengthening. Near sunset, I stopped beside a low ridge covered in ordinary-looking dark rock. The Platinum Group signature was beneath us. Deep, not directly under my feet, maybe offset along a buried structure, but close enough. We spent a week mapping. The company scraped together money for 1 drill hole. 1. If we missed, they might not have funds for another that season. I selected the target with Mr. Choi and their geologists. The drill turned for days. At first, ordinary rock, then altered rock, then sulfides. Nickel and copper signatures grew stronger. I could smell the core as it came out and knew we were close to the weird zone. Then a section arrived that made the inside of my nose feel almost cold. I pointed before anyone logged it. That one. The assays took time. When they returned, the interval contained elevated nickel, copper, platinum, palladium, and other associated elements at levels high enough to make the room go silent. I was one bad sneeze away from becoming the first billionaire whose entire business model could be described as weaponized face holes, which is humiliating as shit. Not proof of a giant mine. Proof we had hit a real system. The tiny exploration company's market value exploded after the public results. Our royalty suddenly mattered. Jisoo printed a fake certificate and framed it in the office. One nose, fractional ownership of mountain. Our accountant removed it because visitors kept asking whether it was legally binding. This was the same accountant who once spent 3 hours explaining why we could not classify nasal moisturizer as heavy exploration equipment. I still think he lacked imagination. The Platinum Project taught me another trick. Some deposits were easier to recognize through their associated rock chemistry than through the valuable element itself. That meant gemstones became possible. Not because emeralds smelled like green money, because emerald-bearing systems had geological clues, beryllium-rich fluids, chromium or vanadium sources, specific host rocks, pegmatites, micas, carbonates, alteration minerals. A gem company invited us to an old emerald district where miners had followed narrow veins for generations. They wanted to know whether unexplored structures existed beneath covered slopes. I spent a morning sniffing rocks worth more per gram than my first car would have cost if I had ever owned one. Emerald itself carried almost nothing obvious, but inclusions, host minerals, and tiny residues created a pattern. In the field, I traced similar alteration beneath soil. The miners opened a small trench. Pegmatite and mica-rich material appeared. Further work exposed a pocket containing several gem-quality crystals. The mine owner handed me one tiny emerald as a bonus. I immediately put it in a bank vault because keeping it at home felt irresponsible. Jisoo asked why I trusted a bank vault when I could smell vault contents from the lobby. I told him that was exactly why I trusted it. If somebody moved my stone, I would know. He said I had become the world's most annoying safe deposit customer. Correct. Then came jade, then sapphire-related corundum deposits, then opal fields. Opal was hilarious because its water content and host geology made some areas smell completely different from others. One prospector watched me kneel beside dry ground, sniff twice, then point at a patch he had ignored for years. He dug. Color flashed in the dirt. The man stared at me and said nothing. I asked if that was good. He told me very politely to get the hell off his claim before my nose bankrupted his remaining sense of self-worth. I left laughing. My power was starting to cause a new kind of problem. Professionals had egos. Imagine spending 30 years learning to read rocks, terrain, instruments, and structure. Then some younger idiot arrives, inhales once, and points at the correct hill. I understood why that could be irritating. So I became careful about presentation. I never said, I found it. I said, my scent observations suggest this target deserves testing. That sentence saved relationships. Jisoo refused to use it. At one meeting, an executive asked him what our preliminary assessment was. Jisoo pointed at me and said, his face says your East Ridge is bussin'. I nearly swallowed my pen. Mr. Choi aged 5 years in 1 second. The executive was 58 and did not know what bussin' meant. We told him it was a technical Korean term. This lie followed us for months. Someone in their geology department eventually looked it up. We received an email containing only a screenshot and a question mark. I forwarded it to Jisoo. He replied with a nose emoji. I considered firing him for almost 6 minutes. Around this time, a government transportation agency asked us for help with a very different project. A huge underground transit expansion had uncovered pockets of contaminated soil from old industrial land. Records were incomplete. They wanted to know whether my ability could help rapidly screen excavated material before laboratory confirmation. I agreed under strict safety procedures. The tunnel worksite was a scent apocalypse. Concrete dust, diesel, steel, lubricants, wet soil, groundwater, old fill, electrical cables, human sweat, cleaning chemicals, industrial residues from decades of city history. Then I separated the layers. One pile of excavated soil smelled ordinary. Another carried petroleum hydrocarbons. A third had solvent-related contamination. A fourth contained elevated metallic signatures suggesting industrial waste. The agency used normal instruments and lab tests to verify everything. My nose was simply fast enough to flag suspicious material in seconds. Then, while walking beside a tunnel wall, I smelled coins. Many coins. old copper alloy. Silver. A little gold. I stopped. The engineer beside me asked whether I detected contamination. I said no. I detected capitalism. The scent came from beyond the excavation boundary, behind old masonry that predated the current station. Historical experts were called. Work paused locally. The wall was examined and revealed a sealed cavity connected to the basement of a long-demolished commercial building. Inside were rusted lockboxes and containers holding old coins, accounting ledgers, tokens, jewelry, and bank documents from decades earlier. Apparently, a financial business had used the basement before urban redevelopment swallowed the block. The city treated it as an archaeological and legal ownership issue. I treated it as proof that cities were basically giant layered cakes made of concrete, pipes, forgotten money, and human nonsense. The local news called it a hidden vault. It was more like a storage cavity. That did not stop Jisoo from buying a black turtleneck and posing beside the tunnel entrance like we had robbed it. The photo was so douchey I could smell the cryptocurrency podcast through the screen. I made him delete it. He had already posted it. 1 million likes. I hate democracy. The buried urban cache created a new service line we never intended to offer. Pre-construction anomaly surveys. Developers with old properties hired us to walk sites before demolition or excavation. I found abandoned heating oil tanks, forgotten utility lines, old wells, buried scrap, contamination pockets, sealed basements, and occasionally valuables. Most finds were boring. One was not. A theater scheduled for renovation had been built over older buildings. I smelled silver beneath the backstage floor. The contractor expected wiring. We found a narrow brick chamber containing thousands of old promotional tokens from a department store that had occupied the site generations earlier. They were not pure silver and not fantastically valuable, but collectors went insane. The theater displayed some in the lobby after renovation. They gave me 1 token in a frame. My home office slowly became a museum of weird things my nose had found. The museum magnet, the token, a meteorite fragment legally gifted by the farmer, a truffle-shaped trophy chairman bag sent as a joke, and a photo of Napoleon the pig glaring at me like a debt collector. The pig photo stayed front and center. I respected a worthy enemy. Then a perfume company challenged me, not for mineral exploration, for revenge. A famous fragrance house had watched my early videos identifying perfumes, and their creative director invited me to a private event. He prepared 100 scent blotters. Some were pure ingredients, some were mixtures, some were finished perfumes. Several were deliberately contaminated with microscopic amounts of unrelated compounds. He wanted to know my limit. I found out his instead. Rose absolute, jasmine, iris, oud, vetiver, patchouli, amber-like materials, citrus oils, synthetic musks, aldehydes, vanilla compounds, smoke notes, leather accords, marine notes. I separated them faster than he could take notes. Then I started identifying contamination. One blotter had been touched by somebody who had eaten potato chips. Another had a trace of coffee from the table. Another had picked up printer toner from a sheet of paper beneath it. One contained the faint scent of a hand cream used by the assistant who prepared the samples. The creative director finally put both hands on his head. Then I smelled his jacket and told him he had visited a horse stable recently. He asked how long ago. I said around 3 days. He stared at me like I had reached into his ass and pulled out his Google location history. That was the most offended anyone had ever looked at accurate information. The event ended with him offering me a fragrance collaboration. I agreed on one condition: no nose-shaped bottle. 6 months later, the fragrance launched in a nose-shaped bottle because marketing people fear neither God nor consequence. It sold out. Jisoo bought 50. I asked why. He said collectibles. I told him he was the reason speculative bubbles happened. The perfume money was tiny compared with mining fees, but the campaign made me famous with a completely different audience. People started asking me to review candles, coffee, whiskey, sneakers, old books, cars, hotels, and even new electronics. I accepted a few because they were funny. A luxury car company put me inside a prototype and asked whether the cabin smelled premium. I told them the adhesive beneath one section of door trim had not fully cured. 3 engineers disappeared with the car. A sneaker company asked me to identify materials blindfolded. I could tell which factory had produced 2 pairs based on glue and rubber formulations. Their executives stopped smiling halfway through. A coffee competition invited me as a guest judge. I described the roast, processing method, origin characteristics, storage condition, and a faint cardboard taint from one batch. Then I had 6 espressos in 40 minutes and spent the rest of the day feeling like my skeleton wanted to leave without me. Super smell did not grant super caffeine tolerance. Important distinction. The comedy jobs gave me breaks between major exploration campaigns, but the impossible smells file kept growing. A nickel signature from a storm system hundreds of kilometers away. A lithium-rich brine pattern caught from a high plateau. Gold carried on dust from a desert I had never visited. Copper drifting across an ocean coastline. Some points matched known mining districts. Some did not. Mr. Choi warned me not to overinterpret them. Long-distance scent transport was messy. Air masses mixed. Dust could travel from roads, factories, mines, ports, and ships. A gold signature might come from ore concentrate being transported, not a hidden deposit. He was right. So we tested one. The strongest unexplained copper smell came from a coastal direction during certain winds. We traced shipping data and discovered bulk carriers transporting copper concentrate through the region. My secret treasure mountain was a boat. Jisoo laughed until he fell off a chair. He added the location to the map under the label Big Wet Truck. I banned him from editing the database. But another impossible smell had no easy explanation. It appeared only during winter winds from a remote inland basin. Gold, silver, copper, arsenic-related minerals, silica alteration. The scent was weak but broad. There were no major producing mines directly upwind, no smelters, no concentrate routes. Public geological maps showed volcanic rocks favorable for mineral systems. Exploration coverage was sparse. I stared at that point for weeks. Then a land package in the basin quietly became available for exploration partnership. Olfacta had never acquired mineral rights before. We were consultants, advisors, specialists. Owning a project meant risk, permits, community relationships, environmental obligations, capital, years of work. It was exactly the kind of complexity I had avoided. Then I smelled the winter wind again. Gold. Faint. Patient. Waiting. I called our lawyer. I asked what it would take to become the thing every mining company feared most. She asked what that was. I said a geologist with money and a nose problem. Our lawyer did not laugh. That should have warned me. 3 months later, after due diligence, negotiations, government filings, local meetings, environmental baseline planning, and enough paperwork to qualify as a sedimentary layer, Olfacta entered a joint exploration venture covering part of the basin. We did not buy a mountain because I smelled something nice. We brought in experienced partners, reviewed old data, checked access, studied land use, and made sure the project could actually be explored responsibly. Sometimes I imagined explaining this to a therapist, then remembered I could probably smell the therapist's lunch, printer toner, and existential dread before sitting down. Then, finally, I stood inside the area that had been haunting my winter mornings. The scent was everywhere. Weak gold-related signatures drifted across kilometers, but they did not come from one obvious source. I walked valleys, climbed ridges, followed streams, smelled road cuts, smelled soils, smelled rocks that looked so boring they should have apologized. For 4 days, the pattern refused to resolve. Jisoo became nervous because this was our own money now. He kept asking whether I was sure. I kept saying no. That was the responsible answer. On the 5th morning, rain arrived. The dry basin transformed. Wet rock released trapped chemical clues. Soil gases shifted. Tiny drainage channels began carrying dissolved minerals. The whole scent map changed, and there it was, a line. Gold, silver, copper, silica alteration, sulfides, not coming from the center of the basin, coming from beneath a ridge that old mapping described as unremarkable volcanic rock. I followed the smell uphill until it split into 2 branches, then 3 hydrothermal fractures. I could smell the fossil plumbing system of an ancient volcano. I stood in rain while everyone else pulled on waterproof gear and stared at the ridge. Mr. Choi asked what I had. I said, the mountain has veins. Jisoo immediately said, bro is smelling geological varicose veins. I told him to shut up before I buried him in our own claim. We sampled. Surface results were modest. That did not bother me. The scent strengthened with deeper fracture indicators. Whatever was interesting sat below the weathered surface. Geophysics showed structures beneath the ridge. Our team designed a drill program. The first hole hit altered rock and low-grade mineralization. The second hit better gold and silver values, but nothing extraordinary. The third missed the main scent corridor almost entirely. Our investors started asking questions. So did I. Had I misunderstood the geometry? I went back to the ridge at night when the air was still. No vehicles, no crews, no drilling dust. I lay flat on the ground like a dead body and inhaled through a tiny fracture in exposed rock. Gold, strong, deep, but the scent traveled upward at an angle. We had been drilling beneath the surface anomaly as if the target were vertical. It was not. The mineralized structure dipped hard toward the east. I walked the ridge for 6 hours, following subtle changes in deep airflow through fractures. By sunrise, I had a new target. Mr. Choi checked the structural interpretation. Possible. We drilled hole 4 from the opposite side. The top 100 meters were boring. Then alteration increased. Sulfidides appeared. Silver signature. Gold. More gold. The core kept coming. At one interval, I smelled gold so strongly I stepped backward. Visible grains were still rare. This was not cartoon treasure. But the rock carried enough microscopic gold and silver that my brain registered it like a bell. Assays confirmed a thick mineralized zone. Hole 5 hit it farther along strike. Hole 6 hit another branch. The Earth had spent billions of years hiding minerals, and I was violating its privacy like a nosy little bitch with a laboratory budget. Within months, we had the early outline of a system far larger than anyone expected. Still not a mine. Still years from certainty. But our tiny consulting company had become part owner of a legitimate discovery. The financial press went feral. My nose plush toy sold out again. An investment channel spent 12 minutes debating whether olfactory geology was a defensible business model. A meme showed me inhaling a mountain through a rolled-up $100 bill. My mother called and asked whether I was doing drugs. I explained it was a joke. She told me the joke made me look stupid. I said I did not create it. She told me I still looked stupid. This is how billion-dollar potential gets humbled by one Korean mother with a smartphone. The discovery brought every major mining company back to our door. Now they did not just want consulting, they wanted partnerships. They offered equity swaps, royalties, joint ventures, strategic investments, exclusive regional agreements, and financial structures so complicated my nose almost tried to smell the contracts for fraud. I refused exclusivity. That was the one rule I would not bend. No single company would own access to me. Instead, Olfacta built teams on several continents. Most work was normal geology, geophysics, geochemistry, environmental science, and data analysis. I appeared only where my ability could change the odds. The funny part was that my nose made everyone else more useful too. If I detected a mineral signature across a giant area, geophysics narrowed the structure. If I smelled groundwater pathways, hydrogeologists modeled flow. If I found a target, drill core told us what was truly there. If I rejected an area, geologists asked why, and sometimes learned something from the pattern. I became less like a lone treasure hunter and more like an absurdly sensitive first-pass sensor attached to a company full of adults. Jisoo remained the exception to adults. He had somehow risen to chief operating officer. This was partly because he was actually good at logistics, negotiation, and reading people. It was partly because every competent operations executive we interviewed looked at our travel schedule and quietly chose peace. Jisoo could organize 3 helicopters, 4 field teams, 2 translators, 6 permits, emergency medical coverage, and a portable lab while eating chips. He also named our internal scheduling software SniffHub. Talent is never distributed fairly. One of our first major joint ventures after the basin discovery involved copper in a desert mountain range. The partner had spent nearly a decade exploring a huge property. They knew copper systems existed, but the best zones remained hidden under gravel and volcanic cover. I arrived during a dust storm. Most people stayed inside. I went outside. The air was disgusting and perfect. Dust carried crushed samples from hundreds of square kilometers. Every gust was a randomized geological database hitting me in the face. I put on goggles and a filtered mask modified with a small sampling valve. Our safety officer made sure I did not inhale enough dust to turn my lungs into a brick. At a certain income level, people call your weird behavior innovation. If I had been broke, someone would have dragged my sniffing ass away from the mountain with a net. Then I started mapping scent directions. Copper here, iron oxides there. Molybdenum faint to the south, a broad zone of potassic alteration dust from somewhere west. The storm shifted. The scent changed. By combining wind direction, timing, and repeated detections, our data analyst triangulated possible source areas. One target sat beneath more than 100 meters of gravel, no outcrop, no obvious surface mineralization. The company had geophysical data there but ranked it moderate. I ranked it smells expensive. Mr. Choi changed that to priority target before the report went out. The drill hole hit a copper-rich intrusive system. Again, not instant mine status, but a real discovery. The company's CEO flew in on a private jet just to see the core. He asked me to smell it for the cameras. I did. Then I smelled jet fuel on his jacket. expensive cologne, steak, cabin leather, and a faint trace of the private jet's bathroom cleaner. For one dangerous second, I knew more about his flight than any man should know about another man's private aircraft bathroom. I kept that information to myself because wealth had finally taught me restraint, mostly. At the press conference, someone asked whether I could smell copper from space. I said no. Jisoo whispered, "Yet." The microphone caught him. Our stock partners did not appreciate the resulting headlines. At year 4, the numbers stopped feeling like numbers. 1% every day had compounded my sensitivity to roughly 2 million times the starting level. 2 million. I could no longer test the limit with ordinary laboratory equipment. Samples had to be diluted beyond practical ranges. Air filters had to be upgraded. Our scent lab used positive pressure, sealed transfer boxes, and procedures borrowed from clean rooms. I could identify which employee had opened a sample cabinet hours earlier from residue on a door handle. I could detect one gold ring in a large auditorium without seeing the person wearing it. I could smell a copper mine from another city under the right weather. At ports, I could identify bulk cargoes before reading ship manifests. I once stood outside a warehouse and told the manager one corner contained nickel concentrate while another held zinc concentrate. He checked the paperwork and asked whether my company sold noses. I told him our current supplier was genetics and whatever cosmic clerical error caused my condition. No bulk orders available. The absurd sensitivity created a challenge nobody expected. Earth itself became loud. The crust contained metals everywhere in tiny amounts. Gold existed in background concentrations. Copper existed in ordinary rock. Rare earth elements were not actually rare in the literal sense. I could detect things that had no economic meaning. So my power evolved from sensitivity to discrimination. I learned not to ask, is gold present? Gold was almost always present somewhere at some microscopic level. I asked, does this spatial pattern imply concentration? I smelled gradients, ratios, mineral associations, fluid pathways. I had reached the stage of success where nobody told me to stop doing weird shit. They simply created a compliance department around it, weathering halos, structures. I was no longer hunting atoms. I was hunting geological organization that made one breath terrifyingly powerful. A company invited me to inspect a mountain belt where they had spent 18 months running regional surveys. I arrived by helicopter, stepped onto a ridge, and inhaled for maybe 10 seconds. Then I pointed toward 2 valleys and said the first smelled like a copper-gold system, the second like mostly pyrite with weak copper, and the ridge behind us was probably a waste of time for their target style. Their exploration vice president looked down at 1.5 years of maps on his tablet. The first valley was indeed their top target. The second had already produced disappointing drilling dominated by pyrite. The ridge behind us had been downgraded months earlier. He asked whether anyone had briefed me. No. He asked whether I had secretly seen their data. No. He asked me to do it again somewhere else. We flew 30 kilometers. I inhaled. I described another target they had not yet drilled. This one was new. The company eventually tested it and found mineralization. That executive later told a conference that his team needed 18 months, aircraft, geophysics, geochemistry, field mapping, and millions of dollars to understand a district that I could partially classify by stepping out of a helicopter and breathing once. The quote went viral. People treated it like proof that geology was finished. It was not. My nose could choose where to look. It could not design a mine, build a processing plant, negotiate with communities, model slope stability, manage water, or make bad ore profitable. I was a shortcut, not a replacement for civilization. Jisoo summarized this more elegantly in an interview. He said, Minho finds where the mountain hid the snacks. Then the engineers spend 10 years opening the bag. For once, nobody asked him to apologize. Our next challenge came from the ocean. A marine research group had collected water and sediment samples near an underwater volcanic system. Hydrothermal vents deposited metals on the seafloor. The researchers were not planning commercial mining. They were studying the chemistry and wanted to know whether my senses could distinguish plume samples from different vent fields. I smelled sealed water samples in the lab. Iron, manganese, sulfur compounds, copper, zinc, trace metals, microbial metabolites. Each vent plume had a fingerprint. Then they took me on a research vessel. The open ocean was overwhelming in a completely new way. Salt, algae, plankton, fish, fuel, paint, metal, deep water, coastal dust hundreds of kilometers away. Under all of that, when the ship crossed above one active vent area, I smelled a faint metallic plume rising through the water and exchanging gases at the surface. I could not pinpoint the seafloor vent by nose alone, not then, but I could tell when we had entered the broader chemical footprint. The researchers compared my observations with instrument readings. They matched more often than they should have. One ocean chemist stared at me for a while and asked whether I understood how annoying I was. If arrogance had a smell, mine probably would have required environmental permitting by then, because every successful drill hole made my ego a little more hazardously industrial. I said yes. She said a machine on deck cost more than my first apartment, and I had just replicated part of its output by standing near a railing and looking constipated. I apologized. She told me not to apologize because she wanted to publish the data. Science is beautiful. The sea trial inspired Olfacta's weirdest technology project. If I could smell air samples from distant places, why did I need to travel at all? We built sealed sampling canisters. Field teams collected air, soil, gas, groundwater headspace, and dust from exploration sites, then sent the containers to our lab under controlled conditions. I could smell them remotely. It was less powerful than being on site because context mattered, but useful for triage. Soon we had sample boxes arriving from 5 continents. Every morning felt like geological speed dating. Box 1, boring basalt. Box 2, interesting sulfides. Box 3, hydrocarbon contamination from the truck that transported it. Box 4, possible copper alteration. Box 5, somebody ate a tuna sandwich while sealing the container. I called the field team. There was silence. Then one geologist admitted it. I told them never to contaminate samples again. Jisoo added no tuna within 10 meters of Minho's dirt to the field manual. Our safety consultant removed his wording and kept the rule. The remote system multiplied our reach. Major mining companies sent us hundreds of blind samples. We ranked targets without knowing locations. Some were tests designed to see whether we were guessing. We passed enough of them that skepticism became expensive. One corporation secretly mixed a sterile control jar into a batch. I smelled it and said it contained no soil, had been cleaned with laboratory detergent, and was probably inserted to mess with me. Their vice president later admitted he had personally suggested the trick. I sent him a nose plush toy with a card that said, "Nice try." He displayed it in his office. By then, the joke had become part of the brand. The world laughed at the nose, then paid the nose millions. Money created increasingly stupid invitations. One luxury watch collector offered me the equivalent of a new sports car to walk through his mansion and find 12 watches he had hidden in boxes, drawers, walls, and furniture. I accepted because sometimes dignity needs a vacation. The first 11 took 6 minutes. Gold cases, steel movements, leather straps, lubricants, polishing compounds. Each watch had a complicated little cloud around it. The 12th was harder. I smelled gold, but the trail wandered through the house. The collector grinned. He had hidden the watch inside a sealed coffee container, placed that inside a vacuum bag, put the bag inside a lead-lined camera case, and buried the case beneath fresh potting soil in an indoor tree planter. It took me 9 minutes. I pointed at the tree. His grin died. We dug out the case. He paid me. Jisoo asked whether this was the point where civilization admitted it had too much disposable income. I said yes. Then the collector asked if I wanted to buy the watch. I said absolutely not. I had just spent 9 minutes smelling that stupid bastard through a ficus. I never wanted to see it again. The video earned more advertising revenue than the appearance fee. That made me feel worse. Another client invited me to a former amusement park scheduled for redevelopment. The park had operated for almost 50 years and accumulated layers of buried utilities, old foundations, maintenance structures, and random metal under landscaped areas. The developers wanted an anomaly survey before excavation. I found pipes, cables, old ride anchors, coins, a steel toolbox, a ridiculous number of aluminum tokens. Then, near the remains of a haunted house attraction, I smelled silver and old paper beneath concrete. The project manager joked that I had found a ghost bank. We opened a utility void with the proper team. Inside was an old employee cash box apparently hidden during the park's early years and forgotten behind later construction. The money was mostly obsolete paper currency and coins, but the box also contained payroll records, souvenir photographs, and a tiny gold commemorative medal. The former park owner, now in his 80s, came to see it. He recognized several people in the photographs. He started telling stories about the park's opening summer. For an hour, nobody cared about the gold medal. That happened surprisingly often. Buried valuables mattered because of money until the moment somebody recognized a name, a photograph, a ring, or a letter. Then value changed shape. I liked those jobs. I just wished history smelled less like mold. One archive basement nearly killed my enthusiasm for culture. Old paper, glue, dust, leather, mildew, rodent residue, cleaning chemicals, metal shelving, and 30 years of air conditioning filters hit me at once. Even with mental filtering, it felt like being punched in the sinuses by every dead librarian on Earth. I found the water seepage they hired me for and escaped in 11 minutes. The archivist asked whether I wanted a tour. I said I respected history too much to continue smelling it. The next major mining contract came from a company called North Star Dominion, which owned a huge old gold property nobody could quite understand. Previous operators had mined shallow, high-grade veins for decades. Modern drilling showed gold deeper down, but the structure was chaotic. Faults cut faults. Veins split, vanished, reappeared, and generally behaved like geological spaghetti designed by a drunk demon. North Star had spent years building a three-dimensional model. They gave me no model at first. I requested that. I wanted a blind test. I walked the property for 3 days and built my own scent geometry. Gold signatures formed planes in space. Some were strong near surface and faded. Others strengthened down fault-related airflow. One broad zone smelled different from the known quartz veins. More sulfides, more carbonate alteration, deeper fluids. I marked everything. Then North Star revealed their model. Most of my major scent planes matched known structures. One did not. The broad, deeper zone cut beneath the old mine at an angle nobody had drilled properly. Their chief geologist stared at my map for so long I wondered if he had fallen asleep standing up. Then he asked why I thought gold was there. I explained the scent pattern. He asked how deep. I estimated 600 to 900 meters to the stronger part. That was the deepest target I had ever seriously called. They drilled. The hole cost a fortune. For weeks, I regretted speaking. Then the core entered the target interval. Gold-bearing sulfides. Not spectacular at first, then stronger. Then a broad mineralized zone continued for dozens of meters. The assays confirmed a significant new style of mineralization beneath the historical workings. North Star's exploration team celebrated with beer. Their chief geologist handed me one and said he had been looking at that mine for 11 years. I braced for resentment. Instead he said, "This is the coolest damn thing that has ever pissed me off." We drank to that. The discovery changed how companies used me. I was no longer just a surface reconnaissance tool. They brought me to mature mines and asked what might be beneath them. That was financially dangerous because a mine already had roads, power, processing plants, permits, and workers. Finding more ore near existing infrastructure could be far more valuable than finding the same ore in the middle of nowhere. I stood above operating mines and smelled downward. Copper systems continued beneath old pits. Gold structures extended under waste dumps. Zinc lenses hid beside known deposits. Sometimes I found nothing useful and saved the company from drilling. Those jobs paid almost as well because a hole not drilled could save millions. One CFO became my biggest fan after I told his team not to test 4 deep targets their internal debate had kept alive for months. Normal Review later agreed the targets were weak. He sent our office a cake shaped like a canceled drill rig. Jisoo ate the drill mast first. That image still haunts me. At a copper mine in a desert, I smelled a mineralized zone beneath the pit wall before anyone showed me the resource model. The mine geologists already knew about it from drilling. I matched the geometry close enough that the general manager started laughing. He asked whether I could smell the mine plan too. I said no. Then I smelled fresh explosives residue from a distant blast area and correctly guessed which section had fired that morning. He stopped laughing. Important note, I never worked near active blasting without normal safety controls. A supernatural nose does not make falling rocks respect you. I had learned that lesson during a quarry visit when a tiny piece of loose gravel rolled down a slope and hit my boot. Nothing happened. But Jisoo screamed as if I had been shot because he was filming content and saw an opportunity. He uploaded a dramatic slow-motion edit with sad violin music. The title implied I had nearly died. It received 8 million views. I was standing beside him when he edited it. I told him he was a whore for engagement. He said, a high-performing whore. Our marketing director walked out of the room. Around this period, Olfacta hosted an annual technical challenge for fun and recruitment. We invited universities and industry teams to create blind scent problems. They tried everything, or hidden among barren rocks. Gold alloy mixed into hundreds of metal samples. Groundwater from different aquifers, soils from contaminated and clean sites, coffee from different origins because Professor Han insisted geology needed joy. One university team built a rotating table containing 1,000 sealed containers. Only one held a tiny gold flake. I stood in the center, turned slowly, and pointed to container 618. Correct. They had expected the test to take an hour. It took 7 seconds. A student in the audience shouted that the challenge was bullshit. I agreed, so they made it harder the following year. 10,000 containers in a warehouse. 1 gold flake. Airflow fans randomized circulation. I walked in, inhaled, and realized the fans actually made it easier by spreading the trace signature. I found the correct row in under a minute. The organizers banned active airflow assistance after that. Then they tried burying gold beneath a sports field, then placing it underwater, then sealing it inside glass. The glass one worked for a while because truly sealed barriers blocked scent transfer. I could not smell through perfect containment. My power still needed information to escape somehow. This became my one comforting limitation. Then I noticed temperature differences around the sealed container caused tiny air patterns, and microscopic residues from handling revealed which box had been treated differently. The organizers called that cheating. I asked how breathing could be cheating in a smell contest. They changed the rules again. My ability had become less about nostrils and more about extracting absurd information from any chemical clue available. That worried Professor Han. He asked whether I experienced headaches, sensory overload, sleep disruption, memory problems, anything neurological. Surprisingly, no. My brain seemed to scale with the power. It did not just receive more signal, it processed and filtered it better every day. I could hold complex scent maps in memory without effort. I could compare a smell with samples from years earlier. I remembered entire geological districts through scent. I joked that my nose had its own cloud storage. Professor Han did not laugh. He made me get more medical scans. Everything looked normal. The doctors hated that. One neurologist spent 40 minutes explaining why my reported capabilities should be impossible, then asked whether I could smell what he had eaten for breakfast. I said egg sandwich, orange juice, and coffee. He asked when. I said approximately 3 hours earlier. He wrote something in his notes with the expression of a man whose medical degree had just been called a little bitch by my nostrils. I almost apologized. Almost. Then I discovered olfactory parallax. That name was Professor Han's. Jisoo wanted nose triangulation, which was unfortunately clearer. If I smelled the same deep target from multiple positions, the scent pathway changed depending on faults, fractures, groundwater movement, and wind. By comparing those changes, I could estimate the three-dimensional position of buried mineralization far more precisely. We tested it at a mine where ore geometry was already known. I stood at 6 locations around the property, inhaled, and recorded direction, intensity, depth, character, associated minerals, and pathway clues. Our team built a crude scent model. It overlapped the known ore body disturbingly well. Then we tested a blind area. I predicted a deep extension northeast of existing drilling. The mine drilled it. Or, suddenly companies stopped asking if I could smell underground. They asked how many drill holes they could cancel. Our rates rose again. I was now the person executives called after spending months building exploration budgets. One breath from me could move $10 million from one valley to another. That kind of influence sounded glamorous until you realized it mostly meant sitting in windowless meetings while finance people argued about drill meters. Superhuman power had somehow led me back to spreadsheets. There is no escape. At least the fieldwork stayed fun. A gold company flew me to an Arctic project where the ground stayed frozen most of the year. Permafrost trapped gases and limited normal soil processes, so I expected weak signals. Instead, summer thaw created concentrated pulses along cracks. The earth burped geology. I followed one gas seep and found a scent combination consistent with gold-bearing sulfides beneath cover. Their existing geophysical data showed a subtle anomaly there. They drilled mineralization. A local field technician asked how I had chosen the spot. I said the ground burped on me. He nodded like that was reasonable. Mining changes your standards. Another job took us into dense tropical jungle where every plant seemed to release 12 fragrances, 3 toxins, and a personal insult. The mineral signals were buried under biological noise. 4 years earlier, I would have detected nothing. Now I filtered vegetation away almost instantly. Copper-bearing groundwater seeped into one stream. Iron-rich alteration changed the soil. Certain plants accumulated trace metals. Tiny sulfur emissions escaped fractures. I walked straight toward a ridge hidden behind trees. The client geologist asked whether I needed the map. I said later. 2 hours later, I marked a target that matched a geochemical anomaly their team had spent 6 months defining. He laughed. Then I marked another target across the valley. He stopped laughing. That second area had barely been sampled. Follow-up work found a new mineralized zone. By now this pattern was almost routine. That was the insane part. Finding hidden mineral systems was becoming routine. Things that once required years of surveys now sometimes took me an afternoon. I should have felt like a god. Mostly I felt tired and hungry. After the jungle project, we returned to camp and I inhaled dinner from 50 meters away. Chicken stew, rice, garlic, chili, onion, ginger. Then I froze. There was truffle oil in the stew. Cheap synthetic truffle flavoring. I looked at Jisoo. He looked at me. We both thought of Napoleon. The pig had become a psychological condition. I refused to eat the stew. Jisoo ate 2 bowls and said revenge was delicious. That night, while everyone slept, I stepped outside the camp and smelled the sky. Not stars, not space, dust. A high-altitude plume had crossed the continent from a distant desert. Inside it was iron, clay, salt, organic matter, industrial pollution, and microscopic mineral particles from thousands of kilometers away. And gold. Not much, but enough. I realized the atmosphere was carrying geological samples around the planet all the time. Every dust storm was an airborne core library. Every river mouth released sediment to the sea. Every wildfire lofted ash containing the chemistry of the land it burned. Every mountain range shed itself grain by grain into the wind. If my nose kept improving, I would eventually read entire regions without visiting them. That thought should have felt exciting. Instead, for the first time, it made the world feel small. Then Jisoo stepped outside in boxer shorts, scratched his stomach, and asked if I was doing Batman nose shit again. The world became normal immediately. The world did not stay small for long. It got loud again. By the beginning of year 5, my sensitivity had climbed into a range so stupid that we stopped putting the number in presentations. The math said millions of times stronger than the version of me who had first identified black pepper through an apartment wall, and it was accelerating toward tens of millions. Investors loved the curve. Doctors hated the curve. Jisoo printed the curve on a t-shirt. The graph rose gently at first, then shot upward like it had remembered rent was due. Underneath he printed, "My boy's nose is compounding." I wore it once under a jacket. A journalist somehow saw it. The shirt sold out online before dinner. I received a box of them from our merchandise partner and donated every single one because I refused to live in a world where my retirement plan had breasts and a cent graph on it. The first truly ridiculous year 5 job began with an auction catalog. A government agency was selling rights to redevelop an old industrial and mining property. The land had hosted a small gold mine almost a century earlier, then a quarry, then storage yards, then absolutely nothing. Historical production was minor. Modern companies had looked at the area and walked away. Most of the property was scarred ground, old waste rock, weeds, and ugly roads. Our business development team saw no reason to care. I smelled the printed catalog, not for geology, for printer ink. Then I looked at the map. Something about the location was familiar. Impossible smells. One of my old unexplained gold signatures, recorded years earlier during a winter wind, lined up roughly with the region. I pulled the file. Gold, silver, sulfur, silica alteration, old mine waste, same direction. Mr. Choi still warned me. A long-range scent from years ago could have come from historical waste on the surface. The land had already been explored. I agreed. Then I went there. The old mine smelled exhausted. Oxidized waste rock, rust, dry soil, weak gold traces scattered everywhere. Nothing impressive. The previous explorers had not been idiots. The obvious veins were small. I walked the property anyway. Near the abandoned quarry, I smelt something beneath the limestone. Gold. Different host rock, different alteration. The old mine had followed narrow quartz veins in volcanic rocks. This signature came from a buried contact zone underneath younger cover on the opposite side of the property. I sat on a rock and started laughing. Jisoo asked what was funny. I told him everyone had been staring at the dead mine while another geological system might be hiding under the quarry. He looked at the barren pit and said, "So the mountain had a side chick." Mr. Choi physically turned away from us. I smelled the contact from 4 positions. Olfactory parallax suggested depth between 300 and 600 meters, depending on the fault geometry. Gold signature strong. Sulfides moderate. Carbonate alteration. Some copper. Maybe skarn-related mineralization. Maybe something else. Our team reviewed old drilling. Nobody had tested that exact geometry deeply enough. We bid for the redevelopment and mineral exploration rights through the normal process. Atlas Crown bid too. So did 2 other companies. Apparently rumors spread that I had visited the site. That was a new problem. My physical presence had become market information. If I spent 2 days in a boring valley, companies assumed I had smelled treasure. Landowners raised prices. Competitors rushed to stake nearby ground. One local newspaper tracked our rental vehicles. I needed stealth. Unfortunately, my face was a meme and our company logo was a nose wearing a hard hat. We had created our own surveillance system through branding. For the auction, Olfacta partnered with a construction group that actually knew how to redevelop the surface land. We valued the mineral upside conservatively because scent was not a drill result. Atlas Crown bid aggressively. They won one nearby parcel. We won the quarry parcel. Jisoo celebrated like we had purchased a dragon. I reminded him we had purchased liabilities, permit obligations, old concrete weeds, and a hole in the ground. He said, yeah, but it's our hole. I could not argue with that level of entrepreneurship. We drilled after approvals and baseline work. Hole 1 hit altered carbonate rocks but weak gold. Hole 2 intersected sulfides with modest gold and copper. Hole 3 found a stronger zone. Then we drilled deeper along the contact. My life was proof that the universe can hand a moron one unfair advantage and watch him accidentally build a multinational company around inhaling responsibly. The 4th hole entered thick mineralized rock with gold values far above anything reported from the historical mine. The system extended beyond the first intersection. More drilling showed multiple zones along the buried contact. The dead little mine suddenly had a very alive basement. Atlas Crown's nearby parcel contained part of the same regional geology, but our highest priority zone sat inside our rights. Their vice president called me, same man who had once offered to buy my company. He asked whether we wanted to cooperate. I said maybe. He asked whether I had known about the buried system before the auction. I said I suspected it. He asked how. I said I smelled it years earlier from another province. There was a long silence. Then he said, I hate negotiating with you. I told him that feeling was mutual and we became partners anyway. Mining is weird. Your rival can spend Monday trying to outbid you and Tuesday sharing drilling costs because the rock does not care about corporate drama. The quarry discovery became famous because the story was simple enough for everyone to understand. Old gold mine looked finished. Weird Nose Man smelled deeper gold. Weird Nose Man's company bought the ugly part. Deeper gold existed. The actual geology was much more complicated. The internet preferred he sniffed a worthless hole and became richer. Fair. A finance influencer created a video titled, Can you invest like the nose guy? The answer should have been no. Thousands of people tried anyway. They started buying shares in random tiny mining companies because maps looked interesting. I posted a warning that exploration was risky and most targets failed. Someone replied, Bro gatekeeping mountains. I closed the app. Again, the Quarry project also introduced the concept of scent privacy. Mining companies began asking whether I could smell their operations from public roads or airplanes. The answer was increasingly yes. A large mine produced a massive chemical footprint. Dust, exposed rock, tailings, processing reagents, fuel, concentrate, waste rock, groundwater, emissions. I could identify some operations from hundreds of kilometers away under favorable conditions. Executives realized competitors could potentially hire me to infer things about their sites. I refused that kind of work. We created an ethics policy against using my ability to gather non-public operational information without permission. Jisoo called it the don't be a creepy nose bastard rule. Our lawyer translated it into 12 pages. I preferred Jisoo's version. Then a national mint invited me for a security demonstration. They had seen the Buried Watch challenge and wanted to know whether high-value metals could be detected through packaging and vault structures. This was not a treasure hunt. It was a controlled test with security officers watching every move. They placed small samples of gold, silver, and base metals in different containers. Some vented, some sealed, some nested behind layers of material. I identified anything with a chemical pathway to outside air. Hermetically sealed containers remained invisible unless handling residues gave them away. Then they took me near a vault corridor. I could smell enormous quantities of metal through door seams and ventilation systems. Gold had that smooth, quiet presence multiplied until it felt like a hole in reality. I stopped walking. The security director asked if I was okay. I said yes. I just had never smelled that much stored wealth before. Jisoo, who had been forced to leave his phone outside, whispered, Does it smell like tax fraud? 3 armed security officers looked at him. He immediately clarified that it was a joke. I have never seen his survival instinct activate faster. The Mint engineers were satisfied that truly sealed storage still blocked direct chemical detection. I was satisfied I had no desire to work near vaults again. Too much gold in one place was aesthetically weird. Natural gold smelled integrated into geology. Vault gold smelled sterile, processed, polished, handled, stacked. One was a mountain whispering. The other was capitalism holding its breath. I did not say that in the report. Professor Han would have mocked me for becoming poetic. He was still teaching part-time, though by then universities treated him like the man who had accidentally adopted a cryptid. His lecture on mineral exploration included one slide with a photo of me sniffing a rock. The caption said, "Non-standard method. Do not attempt to replicate." Students kept trying anyway. Every year, geology clubs posted videos of people sniffing out crops. Most reported scents like dirt, moss, sulfur, or nothing. One student claimed granite smelled like emotional distance. I gave that post a like. The scientific community continued studying me carefully. Researchers tested odor thresholds, neural responses, airflow mechanics, molecular detection, memory, and sensory processing. They learned many things about normal olfaction. They learned almost nothing that explained me. My receptors did not simply multiply millions of times. My brain was doing something impossible with tiny signals. Chemical traces far below normal thresholds became meaningful. Pattern recognition operated across mixtures too complex for instruments to interpret instantly. One researcher described me as a statistical anomaly with nostrils. I put that quote on another business card. Professor Han took one this time. Victory. Then I smelled an earthquake before it happened, not the earthquake itself. Before anyone panics, I did not become a seismic prophet. I was visiting a geothermal area when deep fractures began releasing a different mixture of gases and groundwater chemistry. I noticed the change and told the site team something underground had shifted. Hours later, a small local earthquake occurred. No damage. The researchers went insane. I did not. One coincidence proved nothing. Then it happened again months later at another monitored site. Subtle gas changes, pressure-related groundwater scent differences, then a small seismic event. Still not reliable prediction, but enough to create another research project. The internet headline became, "Nose Man Can Smell Earthquakes." I posted, "No, I cannot." A news account reposted my denial under the headline, "Earthquake Smeller Denies Power." I considered living underground where Wi-Fi could not reach me. Then I remembered I could smell underground better than anyone and realized even my escape fantasies were work-related. My 5th anniversary arrived quietly. No giant party, no press conference. I woke up at home, opened my eyes, and knew before checking the date. 5 years, 1% stronger every morning. Roughly 77 million times the sensitivity implied by the first day, if the compounding model still described what was happening. 77 million. I walked to the balcony before sunrise. The city was cool and still. I filtered away nearby people, roads, restaurants, plumbing, concrete, electronics, dust, and rain residue. Then I opened the range. The world arrived. Sea salt from the coast. Mountain forests hundreds of kilometers away. Industrial belts in distant provinces. Coal dust from rail corridors. Copper concentrate at a port. Sulfur from volcanic regions across the sea. Faint but distinct. Desert dust high in the atmosphere from another country. Iron oxides from dry interior basins. Ocean algae. Refinery emissions. Wet limestone. Granite ranges. River sediment. And gold. Tiny whispers of gold-related geology scattered across distances I could no longer understand emotionally. I stood there in pajama pants and slippers, smelling mineral systems that billion-dollar companies might spend years finding. Then my downstairs neighbor burned toast. The toast punched through every filter because it was 20 meters away. I sneezed so hard I scared a pigeon off the railing. 77 million times super smell, defeated by breakfast. God has a sense of humor, and it is kind of an asshole. That morning, Chairman Wang called. I had not spoken to him in months. He congratulated me on 5 years, which was strange because I had never publicly confirmed the exact anniversary date. I asked how he knew. He said Chairman Bake told him. Apparently the truffle billionaire had built an entire social network around my nose. Then Wang asked whether I wanted to see something impossible. I said that depended on his definition. He said Sioran had a mountain where every normal survey disagreed. Geophysics suggested one thing. Geochemistry suggested another. Historical drilling showed nothing consistent. Satellite alteration maps hinted at a large system. 3 consulting firms had produced 3 different models. They had spent years and more more money than my entire company once earned in its first 2 years. He wanted no report, no presentation, no meeting. He wanted me to stand on the mountain, take one breath, and tell him where to drill. I laughed. 5 years earlier, that request would have sounded insane. Now it sounded like Tuesday. The mountain was in a dry highland region where the air felt thin enough to invoice me for oxygen. Sioran had built roads, drilled holes, flown surveys, sampled streams, collected thousands of rocks, and created three-dimensional models so complicated they looked like someone had dropped neon spaghetti into a glass cube. Chairman Huang kept his promise. No one briefed me. They gave Olfacta the property boundary, safety information, and nothing else. I arrived at dawn. Ms. Yoon, now an executive vice president, met me beside the helicopter. 5 years earlier, she had watched me call a copper system on another Sioran project. Now she simply handed me a radio and asked where I wanted to stand. I looked at the landscape. One ridge west, one valley north, a broad mountain in the center. I chose a small hill near the middle because the wind crossed most of the property before reaching it. We climbed. At the top, everyone waited. I closed my eyes. One breath. The first layer was surface geology. Dry volcanic rock, carbonate units, iron oxides, clay, dust, sparse vegetation, old drill pads, diesel traces from distant equipment. I filtered it. Second layer, groundwater moving through fractures, different aquifers, salts, deep carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds. Filter. Third layer, hydrothermal alteration, quartz, potassium-rich zones, carbonate alteration, sulfides, copper, molybdenum, gold. A lot of geology, but not one simple system. I turned my head east. The scents separated. There were two mineralizing events overlapping each other. An older copper-molybdenum system spread broadly under the central mountain. Later structures had cut through it and introduced gold along narrower zones. That explained the conflicting surveys. Different methods were responding to different pieces. I opened my eyes. Ms. Yoon asked how many targets. I said 4. Then I corrected myself. 5. One shallow copper zone on the west flank. 2 deeper porphyry-style centers beneath the mountain. 1 gold-rich structural corridor running northeast. And 1 weird target under the northern valley where the gold scent strengthened dramatically with depth. Chairman Huang asked which one I would drill first if it were my money. I pointed north. No hesitation. They flew us there. I took another breath. The deep gold signature was enormous. Not necessarily high grade everywhere. Size and grade were different, but something broad sat beneath younger cover, cut by structures carrying gold-bearing fluids. I paced across the valley floor. 500 meters, 700, 1 kilometer. The scent persisted. I estimated the top of the strongest zone at roughly 800 meters in one area, shallower toward the northeast. Ms. Yoon finally showed me one piece of data. A deep geophysical anomaly sat beneath the valley. They had debated drilling it for 2 years. It was expensive and risky. I said, drill it. Chairman Huang asked how sure I was. I said sure enough that if Olfacta could legally participate in the whole cost for a small success interest, we would. His eyebrows moved. That was the first time I saw Chairman Huang surprised by money. The lawyers almost died from excitement. The hole took weeks. It crossed hundreds of meters of ordinary cover and weak alteration. Then sulfides increased. Then copper. Then gold. The core boxes came out faster than technicians could log them. I stood in the core shed smelling the underground before the assays existed. The gold signature strengthened for tens of meters, then weakened. Then another zone began, then another. I could detect precious metals through hundreds of meters of rock, yet I still lost socks in the laundry. Human evolution is a cheap-ass scam, a stacked system. When laboratory results returned, the numbers were strong enough that Sioran immediately planned follow-up drilling. Hole 2 stepped northeast and hit broader mineralization at a shallower depth. Hole 3 confirmed continuity. Hole 4 found a higher-grade section along a structure I had mapped by scent. Months of drilling followed. The potential scale grew. Analysts started throwing around resource scenarios with 10 digits attached, then 11. Not guaranteed value, not cash in a bank, potential metal in the ground under assumptions that could still change, but enough to make the industry lose its mind. A trade journal published the sentence that followed me everywhere after that. Sioran spent 32 months surveying the district. Minho Kang identified the decisive target in one morning. The sentence was unfair to hundreds of professionals whose work helped prove the discovery. It was also fantastic marketing. Jisoo had it printed on the side of our office coffee machine. I asked why. He said motivational environment. I said it made us look arrogant. He pointed at the machine and said, This espresso was surveyed for 32 months. Your mouth will identify the decisive target in one morning. I hated that I laughed. The Siren discovery pushed olfacta into a category I had tried to avoid. Every giant company wanted me urgently. Not next quarter. Not next month. Tomorrow. One CEO offered to send a private jet to pick me up during my mother's birthday dinner. I said no. He doubled the fee. I said no. He offered equity. My mother overheard the call and asked how much equity. I stared at her. She shrugged and said birthdays happened every year. I still stayed. She made seaweed soup. I smelled that the beef had been frozen for 18 days and immediately received a wooden spoon to the shoulder for criticizing dinner. Again, superpowers do not protect you from mothers. The waiting list became politically complicated too. Countries wanted domestic projects prioritized. Companies wanted exclusivity. Universities wanted research access. Environmental groups wanted me to help map contamination. Water agencies wanted drought support. Archaeologists wanted lost sites. Museums wanted artifact detection. Luxury brands wanted me to smell handbags for television. One week my inbox contained a request to evaluate a copper district worth billions and, directly beneath it, a request from a celebrity to identify which of her 12 candles smelled most like divorced mermaid energy. I almost chose the candle job. The mining company offered more. Capitalism narrowly defeated divorced mermaid energy. At this point, we changed the company structure again. Olfacta created separate teams for minerals, water, environmental work, heritage projects, and research. I still could not be everywhere, so we developed portable sampling protocols and trained field crews worldwide. A project no longer started with me. It started with data. If conventional evidence already answered the question, nobody wasted my time. If uncertainty remained expensive, they sent samples or brought me in. My nose became the final weird filter. This made my calendar survivable. Every executive handshake said professional partnership, while the situation itself screamed, please let this unlicensed wizard smell our dirt before we burn another $10 million. It also produced some hilarious calls. A team in South America sent 20 air canisters from a mountain belt. I smelt 19 and ranked 3 as interesting. The 20th smelled like grilled beef. I asked what happened. The field manager went silent. Apparently someone had stored the canister crate near a barbecue during transport. I told them the beef had been cooked over charcoal, seasoned with coarse salt, and slightly overdone on one side. The manager asked whether I could still analyze the geology. I said yes, but first I wanted whoever ruined a $5,000 sampling campaign with lunch to know I could smell his shame across an ocean. Jisoo added barbecue isolation radius to the field protocol. This time the safety consultant kept the exact wording. We were evolving. The more powerful I became, the more I appreciated simple smells. Fresh rice, rain on pavement, coffee before anyone asked me to identify the farm, my mother's soup, old books from a safe distance, pine forest without ore beneath it. I had spent years turning scent into information. Sometimes I deliberately turned the information off. Then the ability found me anyway. One afternoon, I was sitting beside a lake on vacation. Actual vacation. No company helicopter. No rocks and bags. No geologists. Jisoo had gone somewhere else specifically because I told him I wanted 48 hours without hearing the word target. I ate instant noodles beside the water and watched clouds move over distant mountains. Then I smelled gold. Of course I did. I tried to ignore it. The scent was weak. I focused on noodles. Gold again. Different direction. I swore at the lake. A family nearby moved farther away from me. I took one controlled breath. The signature came from sediment along the far shore. Probably trace placer gold carried down from some boring mineralized creek. Nothing important. I smiled and went back to eating. Then another scent appeared beneath it. Old bronze, iron, wood decay, leather residues, coins. A lot of coins. I put the noodles down. The scent came from underwater near an old crossing point marked on a tourism map. I called the local heritage office instead of touching anything. Divers later found remains of an old cargo cart or wagon deposit in sediment near what had once been a shallow route across the lake edge, including corroded fittings and a scattered concentration of historical coins. The find was archaeologically interesting, not financially life-changing. My vacation was ruined anyway because reporters arrived. Jisoo called laughing. He said the universe would not let me clock out. I told him the universe could suck my entire ass through a geological fault. He was silent for 2 seconds. Then he said he was putting that on a shirt. I threatened his life in a legally non-binding way. He sold the shirt. It became our bestseller. I resigned from merchandise approvals. Years after my first black pepper morning, the strangest part was how normal, impossible things had become. A mining company might spend a season flying magnetic surveys, mapping rocks, collecting 10,000 soil samples, building models, and arguing over targets. I would arrive, walk onto a ridge, take one breath and say, "The mineral system is under that valley, but the richer gold is probably along the eastern fault, and the copper center sits deeper to the south." Then everyone would nod and start planning how to test it. Nobody laughed anymore. That was almost disappointing. I missed the days when Professor Han thought I was a circus act, and Mr. No looked personally insulted by my existence. So I created my own entertainment. At one international mining conference, I agreed to a live blind challenge. 5 companies each submitted sealed boxes containing rocks from active exploration projects. I would smell the boxes without knowing the projects and describe what I could. The auditorium was packed. Box 1, copper porphyry alteration, strong pyrite, moderate copper, probably peripheral to the best zone. The submitting company confirmed it came from a low-grade outer area. Box 2, gold-bearing quartz vein system with arsenic-related sulfides, narrow but rich. Correct family. Box 3, nickel sulfide system with ultramafic host rocks. Correct. Box 4, boring sedimentary rock with petroleum residue from drilling mud contamination. The company representative turned red. Their sample had indeed been collected from old oil field storage. Box 5 smelled like absolutely nothing geological because somebody had sent a box containing a rubber chicken. The audience exploded. I stared at the chicken. It wore a tiny hard hat. Jisoo was responsible. Of course. I held the rubber chicken to the microphone and said its assay results indicated 100% bullshit. The conference clip got more views than every technical presentation combined. This is why humanity cannot have nice things. Then, finally, something happened that even I could not laugh off. Not because it was dangerous, because it made no sense. We were testing a new long-range sampling station on the coast. The station continuously captured airborne dust onto replaceable filters. Every few days, a technician sealed the filters and sent them to our lab. Most contained normal regional signatures: sea salt, city pollution, industrial dust, soil, pollen, occasional volcanic ash, shipping emissions. One filter arrived with a metallic pattern I had never experienced. Gold, yes, but too much for ordinary background dust. Platinum group elements, nickel, iron, cobalt, and mineral phases resembling meteoritic material. I assumed contamination. We checked the station. Clean. We checked handling. Clean. We analyzed the filter conventionally. It contained microscopic particles rich in unusual metal combinations. Researchers identified some as likely extraterrestrial dust, which is not shocking by itself. Earth collects tiny amounts of cosmic dust constantly. What was shocking was my reaction. When I smelled the particles, the back of my brain recognized the same cold old sky signature I had first noticed in meteorites years earlier. But underneath it was gold. Enough gold association to stand out. Professor Han said micrometeorites could contain trace precious metals. Perfectly reasonable. Then the next coastal filter contained the same pattern. Stronger, and the next. The particles were arriving in a narrow, seasonal atmospheric stream. Our researchers traced high-altitude winds, but the source remained uncertain. Maybe reworked terrestrial dust mixed with cosmic particles. Maybe a rare atmospheric concentration effect. Maybe something from a recent meteor shower. I should have left it to the scientists. Instead, I went outside at night. I opened my range farther than I ever had before. City, coast, sea, ships, islands, continental dust, high atmosphere. I filtered everything. For several minutes, nothing. Then a microscopic metallic scent touched the edge of perception. Above me, not underground. Above. I looked up. The sky was clear, stars everywhere. I laughed because obviously I could not smell an asteroid in space. Vacuum did not carry scent. Distance did not work that way. My ability was ridiculous, not magic enough to ignore physics completely. Then I realized I was not smelling the source. I was smelling dust that had already entered the atmosphere. A trail, a chemical breadcrumb. Something was shedding metal-rich particles into Earth's path. I called Professor Han at midnight. He answered on the 4th ring and asked if somebody was hurt. I said no. He asked if I had found another mine. I said maybe the opposite. He was silent. Then he said he hated when I spoke like that. Within days, astronomers joined the discussion. There were several candidate near-Earth objects whose orbital debris could potentially intersect atmospheric streams, though connecting microscopic dust to one specific body was extremely difficult. One candidate was a metal-rich asteroid scheduled for future observation. No one claimed it contained giant amounts of gold. No one sane, anyway. Jisoo read one speculative article and immediately asked whether olfacta exploration needed a space division. I said no. He registered the internal project name olfacta space before I finished the sentence. Our lawyer developed another stress twitch. I thought that would be the cliffhanger of my week. It was not, because the next morning, exactly 1% stronger again, I woke before sunrise and smelled something beneath my apartment. Deep, so deep that at first I assumed my brain had mixed regional signals. I went to the balcony. The scent remained gold, a massive gold-related signature, but diffuse, spread across an impossible area. I turned north. It followed. South, still there. East, west, every direction. Not a mine, not a district, not a mountain. Something in the deep crust beneath the entire region was suddenly visible to my nose because my sensitivity had crossed another threshold. I could smell geological layers kilometers below me, maybe tens of kilometers in some indirect way through gases, groundwater, faults, and crustal chemistry. I stood frozen. Then the scents separated. Upper crust, deep faults, ancient intrusions, metamorphic belts, metal pathways created hundreds of millions of years ago. It was not treasure sitting in one pocket. It was the plumbing of the planet, and inside that plumbing, certain pathways were far richer than anything near the surface suggested. At some point my nose stopped being a body part and became a hostile takeover of common sense, complete with lawyers, investors, and one idiot selling merchandise. One of them ran offshore, far offshore, beneath the sea. I focused. The signature strengthened along a direction no mining company had ever hired me to investigate. Gold. Copper, something dense and unfamiliar. Then another pattern beneath it, deeper still, so strong my knees actually weakened. I grabbed the railing. My phone rang. Jisoo, I answered without looking away from the horizon. He asked if I was awake because Chairman Hwang wanted to schedule another project. I said cancel my morning. He asked why. I told him I had just smelled something under the ocean. He groaned and said, please tell me it's not Atlantis. I said I did not know what it was. That made him stop joking. I went back inside, opened a geological map, and traced the offshore direction. No major known deposit. No producing mine. No obvious explanation. Just deep crust, old tectonic boundaries, volcanic history, and a huge area nobody had ever surveyed for what my nose was telling me. Then I checked the daily compounding calculation. Tomorrow, 1% stronger. The day after that, another 1%. A year from now, dozens of times stronger again. 5 more years, numbers so stupid I refused to calculate them. I looked at the map, then at the sealed meteorite sample on my shelf, then out toward the ocean. For the first time in years, I had no idea whether the most valuable thing I could smell was buried beneath the ground, hidden under the seafloor, or falling toward us one microscopic grain at a time. And right when I thought my life could not get any more ridiculous, Jisoo sent me a message. He had already mocked up 3 logos for Olfacta Space. One was my nose wearing an astronaut helmet. I stared at it for 10 seconds. Then a new scent reached me through the open balcony door. Faint, metallic, impossible. Not from the ocean, not from the city, not from any direction along the ground. I slowly looked up. My phone buzzed again. Jisoo had sent one more message. Bro, if you smell gold on the moon, I'm buying a rocket. I did not answer, because I was still staring at the sky. And for the first time since this whole insane thing started, I was genuinely afraid to take a second breath.